Howdy folks. You're watching The Fiction Wizard. Sit tight because today we bring you McGonagall saw Harry's scars during first class. She Floo'd ministry before lunch. Smash that like, subscribe, and enjoy the ride. Chapter 1, The Matchstick. The thing about Minerva McGonagall was that she noticed everything. It wasn't a skill she'd cultivated so much as a reflex built over 30 years of teaching. The same way a shepherd develops an eye for a limping sheep in the middle of a flock, she had developed an eye for children who were not quite right. Not academically. Academically, she could spot a struggling student from across a room and have them sorted into a tutoring schedule before they knew they needed one. What she'd learned to spot, over decades of first-year Transfiguration classes, was something quieter and harder to name. The way certain children sat. The way they held themselves when a teacher's voice went sharp. The way they reached for things carefully, like they expected objects to be pulled away. She'd seen it before. Not often. But enough times that she knew what it meant, and what it cost a child to wear that kind of caution like a second skin. September the 2nd, 1991. 8 minutes past 9 in the morning. She had been teaching Transfiguration for 29 years, and she had opened this particular class the same way every single time, with the matchstick-to-needle demonstration, then the desks cleared, then 30 matchsticks placed individually before 30 first-years who were still vibrating with the novelty of being here at all. The demonstration never failed to quiet a room. That was why she used it. There was something about watching a piece of dead wood become a sliver of silver that reached inside even the most overexcited 11-year-old and pulled them into something like wonder. She did the demonstration. The class went appropriately silent. She set them to work. She walked. This was the real lesson, not the one on the board, which they would all fail at today and most would fail at for the next week, but the lesson she gave herself every September 2nd, walk the room, learn the faces, learn the hands. Hands told you more than faces. Faces could be composed. Hands were where the truth lived, in how tightly they gripped the matchstick, in whether the fingers trembled with excitement or with fear, in whether the student watched the wood or watched her. She reached the window row. Ronald Weasley was muttering at his matchstick with an expression of profound personal offense, as though the wood had insulted him and he was deciding whether to escalate. She made a note to call on him in 2 minutes, which would startle him into actually trying. Hermione Granger had her matchstick 6 inches from her face and was staring at it with a ferocity that suggested she was attempting to transmute it through willpower alone. Close, but not quite, too much intellectual effort, not enough surrender to instinct. She would get it by Thursday. She passed Neville Longbottom, whose matchstick had developed what appeared to be a small nervous twitch in sympathy with its owner, and made a second note. She reached Harry Potter. He was seated at the end of the row, not by choice. She'd assigned seats alphabetically, which she always did for the first month, until she could read the room well enough to know where everyone needed to be. He was bent over the desk with his sleeves pushed to his elbows, which was sensible, as the morning was warm for September. He was concentrating hard, she could see it in the set of his jaw, but concentrating the right way, the instinctive way, not Granger's academic assault but something quieter and more patient. She was about to move on. Then she looked at his arms. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, the looking. She had been moving between desks and she stopped, very still, in the way that a person stops when the ground shifts unexpectedly under their feet. She did not make a sound. She was far too controlled for that. But inside the controlled exterior, something that had been simmering in her chest for 30 years of watching children came to an immediate, furious boil. His forearms were wrong. That was the only word her brain produced before the more precise language followed. The left arm showed a burn scar that ran from the inside of his wrist to roughly 3 inches up toward his elbow, old, fully healed, years old, the skin there a different texture than the surrounding area, slightly puckered. On the right forearm, 2 parallel lines, thin and white, that were not consistent with an accidental scrape. On the back of his right hand, a patch of scar tissue that she recognized, with a cold drop in her stomach, as the kind that formed when someone was made to kneel on a hard surface for a prolonged period. She looked at his face. He was watching his matchstick with total focus, completely unaware of her scrutiny, the tip of his tongue barely visible between his teeth. He didn't know she was looking. He also clearly didn't know there was anything remarkable about his arms. He'd pushed his sleeves up without a second thought, the way you did when you were warm, the way you did when the possibility that anyone might look and find something wrong had never once occurred to you because no one ever had. She moved on. She made herself move on, because she was in the middle of a class and 30 children needed her present and functional, and because the alternative was stopping in the middle of the room and saying something that could not be unsaid in front of 29 witnesses. She moved on, and she walked to the board, and she said something technical about the nature of molecular restructuring in simple wooden objects, and she heard her own voice doing its job perfectly while the rest of her brain did something else entirely. She was cataloging dates, procedures, names. By the time she reached her desk, she had a plan. "Miss Granger," she said, in her most ordinary classroom voice, "would you come to the front and assist me with the second demonstration? I find a student's perspective is sometimes more instructive than a teacher's." Granger was out of her seat before the sentence was fully finished. Good. That would occupy the class. She sat behind her desk and, under the cover of appearing to organize papers, she wrote a memo. Not a standard inter-office memo, those went through the Hogwarts internal system, logged automatically, available to the headmaster and the deputy headmistress equally. This one she wrote on her personal ministry correspondence parchment, the small, cream-colored sheets she'd carried since her days working the accidental magic reversal squad 30 years ago, before teaching. She had a specific contact at the Department of Magical Child Welfare, a woman named Edith Farrow who'd been processing abuse cases for 15 years and whom Minerva had sent exactly 4 letters to in 3 decades, each one accompanied by a child's name and a short description. This was the 5th. "Edith. I need a formal inquiry opened today. Not tomorrow. Today. The child is Harry James Potter, currently enrolled as a first year at Hogwarts School. I observed physical scarring consistent with sustained and deliberate harm, burned scar, left forearm, approximately 4 years of age based on healing. Additional scarring, right forearm and right hand. The child is 11 years old and has been living with his Muggle relatives since the death of his parents in 1981. I will be in the ministry by noon. Please ensure Amelia Bones is informed. M. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, Hogwarts." She folded the parchment, tapped it twice with her wand, and it disappeared with a very soft sound, like a breath. She looked up. Granger was at the front of the class demonstrating something earnest and mostly incorrect about visualization technique. Harry Potter was still bent over his matchstick. As she watched, the tip of the matchstick shifted, very slightly, barely perceptible, to silver. Just the tip. Just for a moment. Then it went back to wood. But she had seen it. She let class run another 12 minutes. She was a professional and these were 11-year-olds and it wasn't their fault, and she had made the mistake of being genuinely angry at children before, not often, but enough times to know that it helped no one. She walked the room again, corrected Longbottom gently, told Weasley his instinct was actually rather sound even if his method needed work, and said nothing at all to Harry Potter except a brief, "Good focus, Mr. Potter." Give it time, because that was true and because he deserved to hear it and because she needed to look at him without letting anything on her face tell him that something had happened. He looked up at the word "focus" with a faint surprise, the way children looked up when they expected correction and received something else, and she kept walking. At 21 minutes past 9, she said, "That will do for this morning. We'll continue Thursday. Read Chapter 2 and come prepared to explain the theory of molecular intention in your own words, not the book's words, your own." Class dismissed. The room erupted into the usual noise of 30 children decanting themselves from desks. She watched them go. She watched Harry Potter go. He left in a cluster with Weasley, talking about something. gesturing, pulling his sleeves back down as he slung his bag over his shoulder. He was laughing at something Weasley said. A real laugh, the kind that scrunched the corners of his eyes. He had green eyes, she'd noticed, even through those terrible glasses, bright and alive and completely, devastatingly ordinary in the way all children were ordinary, in the way that made the marks on his arms a kind of obscenity. When the room was empty, Minerva McGonagall sat down behind her desk. She allowed herself exactly 45 seconds. Then she stood up, straightened her robes, walked to the fireplace in the corner of her classroom that connected, as all faculty fireplaces did, to the Hogwarts Floo'd network, and she picked up the pot of powder from the mantel. Normally she would notify the headmaster before leaving the castle on personal business. She did not notify the headmaster. She threw in the powder, stepped into the green flame, and said, "Ministry of Magic, Atrium, London." The ministry on a Tuesday morning in early September had the particular hum of an institution that believed itself more important than it was and organized itself accordingly. Witches and wizards in robes of various quality swept through the atrium in all directions, clutching files, talking to memos that fluttered alongside them like obedient paper birds, queuing for the lifts with the resigned expressions of people who had been queuing for lifts here for 20 years and had made their peace with it. McGonagall stepped out of the flue and into the atrium and did not slow down for any of it. She took the lift to level 8, Department of Magical Child Welfare. It was not, she reflected as the lift descended with its grinding, magnificent unreliability, a department that most people in this building could find without a map. It was staffed by 14 people, had a budget that wouldn't have covered the catering at the last ministry gala, and processed an average of 30 cases a year, which was, she knew from Edith Farrow's occasional, dry-toned correspondence, approximately 1/10 of the actual number of cases that existed. The gap between those two numbers was not an accident. She was aware, in the precise and unforgiving way she was aware of most things, that the British magical world had a particular talent for not seeing what it didn't want to see. The Muggle-born who struggled with culture shock were resources to be leveraged, not people to be supported. Children from difficult homes were grateful to be at Hogwarts, weren't they? The magical world had saved them. What could be so bad? And Harry Potter was their symbol. Their proof that goodness could endure. He'd survived Voldemort. He was the boy who lived. The boy who lived did not have scars on his forearms from his aunt and uncle's house. He did, though. She pushed open the door to level 8. Edith Farrow was waiting for her in the corridor. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet, with white hair cropped close and eyes that had seen too much and processed it all into something like granite patience. She had a folder in her hands and an expression on her face that Minerva recognized from her own mirror, the controlled exterior over the thing that was very hot and very furious underneath. "You got the memo," Minerva said. 12 minutes ago. Edith held up the folder. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Minerva. When you send me a name, I start a file immediately, because you don't send names unless you're certain." "I'm certain." "I know you are." Edith opened the folder. Harry Potter. Born July 31, 1980. Parents, James and Lily Potter, deceased November 1, 1981. Guardianship assigned by Albus Dumbledore, not by this department, not through any formal legal process registered with us, to Petunia Desley née Evans, maternal aunt, and Vernon Desley, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. "We have no file on this child, Minerva. None. There has never been a welfare check. There has never been a registration. There has never been a single piece of parchment from anyone asking how he was doing." A silence. 9 years, Minerva said. 9 years, Edith agreed. They looked at each other. "Amelia?" Minerva asked. "She's in her office. She knows you're here." Edith closed the folder. "She was not happy when I explained why." "Was she not happy with me or not happy with the situation?" "The situation. You, she wants to shake by the hand." Edith paused. She used language I won't repeat in a professional context. Good, said Minerva, and meant it with her whole chest. Amelia Bones's office was on level 2, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and it was the kind of office that reflected its occupant accurately, functional, organized, with a wall of files that ran floor to ceiling and a desk that was covered in paperwork she was clearly actually reading rather than performing reading of. She wore a monocle, which she'd been wearing since a hex in her 30s had slightly complicated her depth perception on the right side, and she looked at you through it with an attention that most people found disconcerting. She was standing when Minerva arrived. That was notable. Amelia Bones did not generally stand for people, not out of discourtesy, but because she was a practical woman and standing was less efficient than sitting when you had work to do. Standing meant this conversation had her full self. Sit down, Amelia said. I'd rather sit, Minerva. We're going to talk for 10 minutes before I do anything, because I need the details in order and I need them from your mouth, not from a memo. She gestured at the chair across from her desk. Sit. Minerva sat. She told it straight. She was not a woman who embroidered or softened. She described what she'd seen, the burn scar, the 2 parallel lines, the scarring on the back of the hand. She described its approximate age, she described Harry Potter's demeanor during class, the fact that he'd pushed his sleeves up without any awareness that doing so might reveal something, and the fact that his magical response was already exceptional for a first year, which told her whatever had been done to him had not broken the thing that mattered most. When she finished, Amelia was quiet for a moment. How did Dumbledore place him with those people without any formal process, she asked. It was not really a question. It was a woman organizing the shape of her fury into something precise and useful. He carried the boy there himself. In the night. Left a letter. Minerva paused. I was there. I argued against it. I was overruled. She let that sit. I have thought about that night regularly for the past 9 years, and I have not given myself the grace of thinking I could not have done more. I could have. I didn't. Amelia looked at her steadily. Are you telling me that now so I can put it in the file, or for another reason? Both, Minerva said. If there are consequences for me, I accept them. I'm not here to protect myself. I'm here because I looked at a child's arms this morning and I refused to look away from what I saw. Another silence. Amelia picked up her quill, made a note, set it down. I'm going to open a formal DMLE inquiry alongside the child welfare process, she said. That means I can issue a warrant for the Dursley residence, which gives me investigative access that child welfare alone can't compel. It means Aurors, not just welfare workers. And it means this goes on record as a criminal matter. Good, Minerva said, for the second time that morning. It also means I have to notify the Wisengamot that an inquiry is being opened into the circumstances of the boy who lives living arrangements. Amelia's mouth thinned. That is going to be complicated. I imagine several people in this building are going to be very uncomfortable very quickly. Several people in this building knew and said nothing. I know. Including the headmaster. Yes, Minerva said. I know that too. They regarded each other across the desk with the particular understanding of 2 women who had spent their careers in institutions designed by men who believed themselves to be the cleverest people in every room, and who had therefore learned to be more precise, more thorough, and more quietly relentless than any of those men would ever require themselves to be. I'll have the warrant issued by noon, Amelia said. I'll send a team to Surrey tonight. He doesn't need to be present for that. Not for the initial inspection. We gather evidence first. The interview with the child happens here, formally, with appropriate support in place. Amelia set down her quill. How is he? Today, when you saw him? Minerva considered this. He was laughing with his friend on the way out of class, she said finally. A real laugh. He's resilient in a way that is either admirable or breaks your heart, depending on how you look at it. Probably both, Amelia said. Probably both, Minerva agreed. She returned to Hogwarts by the Floo'd at 11:47, which meant she had, as promised to herself, completed this before lunch. She stepped back into her classroom fireplace, brushed green ash from her robes, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the room. The matchsticks were still on the desks, 30 of them. Most had remained entirely wood. 3 or 4 showed the faint silver sheening at the tip that marked a student who was close. One, she walked to the end of the row and picked it up. One had turned almost entirely to silver, except for a small, stubborn cylinder of wood at the base. Harry Potter's desk. She was certain of it, she'd noted his seat when she assigned it. He'd gone halfway to a needle on his first attempt at Transfiguration. She set it down carefully, like it was something fragile, which it wasn't, but the impulse was there anyway. She went to the window. Below, the Hogwarts grounds rolled out in the September sunshine, the lake flat and bright, the beech trees at the edge of the forest casting long morning shadows. She could see some first-years by the lake, too far to make out faces, but she could see 2 of them, a red-haired one and a dark-haired one, sitting at the edge of the water, probably talking about something entirely ordinary and 11 years old. She watched them for a moment. She had been teaching for 29 years, and she had learned, over that time, that there were certain things you could do in your classroom and certain things you could not. You could teach a child to transform a matchstick. You could correct their grip, redirect their instinct, tell them when they were close. You could not undo what had been done to them before they arrived at your door. You could not reach back through 9 years of someone else's choices and pull a child out of harm. All you could do, all anyone could do, was the thing in front of you, when it presented itself. The thing in front of her, this morning, had been a burned scar on a boy's arm. She had done the thing. That was not enough. It would never be enough to make the 9 years not have happened. But it was the thing that could be done now, and she had done it, and she would not sleep tonight, but she would be able to look at herself in the mirror, which was more than she'd been able to say for certain other mornings over the past 9 years. She heard footsteps in the corridor, the distinctive clattering of many small feet, lunch period approaching, students flowing between classes like water through corridors that had been shaped exactly for them over centuries. She straightened her robes. Smoothed her expression back to its professional architecture. She had an afternoon of teaching. She had a meeting with the charms department at 3 o'clock. She had a stack of placement assessments to review. She had, also, set something in motion this morning that would not stop, could not be stopped, should not be stopped, even though she was aware with perfect clarity that the reverberations of it would reach Dumbledore's office before the day was out, and that the conversation that would follow would be the most difficult conversation she had had in this building in decades. Let it come. She was a Gryffindor, after all, and she was 73 years old, and she had learned long ago that the things worth doing were generally the things that made your hands shake a little, and that shaking hands were not the same as uncertain ones. Her hands were not uncertain. Albus Dumbledore was in his office at noon when the memo arrived. He was eating a sherbet lemon and reading a paper from the International Confederation of Wizards on the subject of dragon reserve management in Romania, which was less interesting than it sounded, and he was composing, in his head, his response to a letter from the Norwegian Minister for Magic who wanted his opinion on something he had already given his opinion on twice, when the small amber memo bird landed on his desk and sat there. He picked it up. He read it. He sat very still for a long moment. Fawkes shifted on his perch and made a low, soft sound, the kind he only made when the emotional temperature in the room had changed significantly. Dumbledore said, to no one in particular. The memo was not from McGonagall. It was from the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a notification that a formal inquiry had been opened into the welfare and living circumstances of one Harry James Potter, age 11, and that the relevant department heads would be in contact with the school within 24 hours to arrange an interview. He had not been consulted. He had not been notified before the inquiry was opened. He had, in fact, been notified after the fact, in the same memo that had gone to the school's Board of Governors, the Department of Magical Education, and his eyes went back to the list of recipients, the Wisengamot Oversight Committee. Albus Dumbledore was, among many other things, a man who had spent 60 years being the cleverest person in most rooms, and who had arranged the world around him with a patience and precision that most people mistook for omniscience. He was not omniscient. He was simply very good at looking ahead, at running the branches of possibility forward through time and pruning the dangerous ones before they could blossom. He had not seen this branch. Or rather, he looked at the memo again, then set it down, then laced his fingers together and looked at Fawkes with an expression that was, for him, unusually unguarded. He had seen it as a possibility. He had considered, over the years, whether someone might notice. He had decided the risk was manageable, that Harry's situation was not ideal but was necessary, that the protections on Privet Drive required a bond of blood and that love, even difficult love, even imperfect love, even, he had not allowed himself to complete that sentence, most of the time. Minerva had completed it for him. He wasn't sure, in this moment, whether he was angry at her. He didn't think he was. He thought, and this was an uncomfortable thought, the kind that lodged itself uncomfortably in the chest, he thought he might be, underneath the disruption and the concern about his plans, relieved. In the way that a man was relieved when a thing he had suppressed for years was finally said out loud by someone with the courage to say it. He reached across his desk for a piece of parchment. He began to write a letter to Minerva. He got as far as the salutation before he stopped, set down his quill, and decided that this was a conversation that needed to happen in person. He stood up, and Fawkes watched him with bright, knowing eyes, and he walked to the door of his office and opened it and stood for a moment at the top of his spiral staircase. Somewhere in this castle, Harry Potter was eating lunch, laughing with his new friends, completely unaware that by this time tomorrow, the shape of his life would look different. Was that a bad thing? He had believed, for 10 years, that he knew what Harry needed. That the shape of things, the sacrifice, the blood protection, the difficult childhood that would produce a particular kind of courage, a particular kind of humility, was necessary. He had told himself the discomfort was the point. That a boy who knew hardship would not be corrupted by greatness. He had not, in making those calculations, spent enough time with the image of a burned scar on a child's forearm. He had not. And he knew it. And Minerva knew it. And Amelia Bones and Edith Farrow and the entire ministry apparatus that was now grinding into motion all knew it. He went down the staircase. He went to find Minerva. She was in the great hall, at the staff table, eating a bowl of soup with the economical efficiency of someone who had allocated 12 minutes to lunch and intended to use them precisely. She looked up when she heard him approach, and her expression was entirely composed, not cold, not defiant, just settled. Like a person who had made a decision and had the particular stillness of someone who was completely at peace with it. He sat down beside her. She didn't speak first. She had always had, he reflected, a formidable capacity for silence. The ministry contacted me, he said. They contacted me as well, she said. I expected them to. You went to Amelia Bones. I went to child welfare first. Amelia was involved because the evidence warrants a criminal inquiry. She set down her spoon. Albus, the child, had a burned scar on his forearm. Not a kitchen accident. Old, deep, on the inside of his wrist. He's had it for years. Dumbledore was quiet. I know, he said. The two words sat between them. Minerva looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression she reserved for situations that required her to say something she had been saving up for a significant length of time. How long have you known? She asked. I have suspected, he said carefully, that the environment was not ideal. I did not know the specifics. You didn't ask for the specifics. No. You didn't check. I received assurances, from whom? Her voice was perfectly level. This was, he knew, more frightening than if she'd been furious. Who in that house would have given you an honest answer? You placed a child in a home with people who hated magic and you trusted them to report accurately on how they were treating him. He didn't answer. You didn't check because some part of you didn't want to know, she said. Not cruelly. Simply, precisely, the way she did mathematics. Because if you knew, you'd have to do something, and doing something would have disrupted the plan. Around them, the great hall was loud with 150 children eating lunch. The noise was extraordinary. Neither of them looked away from the other. The blood protection, he began. The blood protection kept him alive, she said. That is the best that can be said for it. He is alive. He is also 11 years old and has scars on his arms that no child should have, and I will not apologize for reporting what I saw. She picked up her spoon again. I don't expect you to apologize either, Albus. I know why you made the choices you made. I disagree with them. I will continue to disagree with them. But I am not interested in an argument about the past. She took a spoonful of soup. The ministry is going to conduct an inquiry. The Dursleys are going to be investigated. Harry is going to be interviewed. His guardianship situation will be reassessed. All of that is now in motion, and it cannot be stopped, and I would not stop it if I could. Another silence. What do you need from me? He asked. It was, she thought, perhaps the most important question he had asked in quite some time. I need you to cooperate with the inquiry. Fully, without maneuvering. She looked at him. And I need you to trust that Harry will be stronger for this, not weaker. That a child who has been freed from a cage does not become less brave. He becomes something else, something I think is going to surprise everyone in this building considerably. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the great hall. The first-year tables were loud and bright, children discovering their houses, making their first friendships, navigating the enormous unfamiliarity of this world. At the Gryffindor table, he could see, if he looked, a dark-haired boy turned sideways in his seat, waving his fork in the air to illustrate some point he was making to a red-haired boy who was laughing too hard to eat. He managed half a needle this morning, Minerva said, following his gaze, and there was something in her voice that was not quite pride but was in the same family. First attempt. Did he? Said Dumbledore softly. He did. She finished her soup. Folded her napkin. Placed it precisely at the corner of her bowl. He is extraordinary, Albus. Whatever they did to him, they didn't touch that. And we have an opportunity, the school has an opportunity, to give him what he should have had to begin with. She stood up. Don't waste it by trying to manage the outcome. She picked up her bag, nodded briefly, and walked away from the table. Dumbledore watched her go. Around him the great hall hummed and chattered and rattled with cutlery, alive with the daily ordinary miracle of children growing, and at the Gryffindor table, Harry Potter threw his head back laughing at something Ron Weasley had said, his glasses slightly askew, looking for all the world like a boy who didn't know yet that today was the day things had started to change. He didn't know yet. But it had started. Minerva McGonagall had seen something at 9:08 on a Tuesday morning and had refused to look away, and the thing that had been set in motion before noon would not stop now, would gather momentum and weight and consequence, would roll through the carefully arranged architecture of plans and protections and quiet decisions made in the dark, and maybe, Albus Dumbledore allowed himself to think, as he watched the boy laugh, maybe that was all right. Maybe some things needed rolling through. The great hall blazed with noise and September light, and somewhere in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Amelia Bones was signing a warrant, and in Surrey, the Dursleys did not yet know that the quiet arrangement they'd maintained for 9 years had, as of this morning, run out of time. Chapter 2, The Interview. The owl arrived at Dumbledore's office at 7 in the morning. Harry didn't know about that. Harry was in the middle of a disagreement with Ron about whether the moving staircases had personalities or were just broken, and the disagreement was important enough to carry them all the way from the dormitory to the Great Hall, where Hermione joined them at the Gryffindor table, listened to 30 seconds of it, and said that staircases were inanimate objects and the idea of them having preferences was both scientifically and magically illiterate, which escalated things considerably. It was Thursday. 2 days since the first Transfiguration class. Harry had thought about that class exactly once since it happened, not about the matchstick, though he'd thought about the matchstick plenty, lying awake and turning the memory of that silvery tip over in his mind like something precious, but about Professor McGonagall stopping at his desk. The pause. The way she'd looked at his arms for just a moment before she'd said something about focus and moved on. He'd thought about it once, decided he probably hadn't done anything wrong because she hadn't said he had, and moved on. This was something he was very practiced at, deciding things hadn't been as significant as they'd felt and moving on. You developed that skill when the alternative was spending all your time trying to decode what adults meant versus what they said, which was a loop that never resolved and exhausted you in the meantime. So he ate breakfast. He ate a great deal of breakfast, actually. This was still new enough to be remarkable, the food here, the way the plates just filled, the way nobody was counting portions or making pointed comments about how much a boy with his build needed. He ate bacon and eggs and toast and half a grilled tomato and thought about the Transfiguration chapter he'd read last night and whether he could replicate what had happened with the matchstick on purpose. He was debating trying the butter dish, not seriously, not yet, not in the middle of the Great Hall, when Professor McGonagall appeared at his shoulder. He looked up. Her face was its usual composed architecture, but there was something careful in her eyes, not unkind, just precise, like she was calculating something. "Mr. Potter," she said, "when you finished breakfast, would you come to my office?" "No urgency, finish eating." "Did I do something?" he asked. "Automatic." He heard himself say it and felt the familiar small contraction in his chest that came with that question. "No," she said, clearly and without hesitation, and something about how quickly she said it, like she'd anticipated the question and had the answer ready, made the contraction ease slightly. "I simply need to speak with you." "Take your time." She walked away. Ron looked at Harry. "What was that about?" "No idea," Harry said. He finished breakfast. He took his time, because she'd said to, and taking adults at their word when they said something non-threatening was another skill he was trying to decide whether to trust. He ate the rest of his toast. He drank his pumpkin juice. He watched the ceiling, which was showing a pale autumn sky with high clouds, and he tried to identify the feeling in his stomach, which was not quite anxiety and not quite anticipation. He wasn't afraid. That was notable, actually. He probably should have been. Being called to a professor's office 3 days into his first week was not, historically speaking, the kind of event that preceded pleasant things, but he wasn't. Something about the way she'd said no to him. Quick and clear, like a fact. He said goodbye to Ron and Hermione, slung his bag over his shoulder, and went. McGonagall's office was off the corridor behind her classroom, a room that reflected her in the same way Dumbledore's reflected him, practically, severely, with a small concession to personality in the form of a tartan-patterned cushion on one of the chairs and a framed painting of the Scottish Highlands that occasionally produced audible wind. Her desk was clear except for a neat stack of assessment papers and an inkwell. The fireplace was lit. There was someone else in the room. Harry stopped in the doorway. The woman standing near the fireplace was not a Hogwarts professor. She was stocky and square-shouldered, with steel-gray hair pulled back and a monocle over her right eye and an expression that was assessing him with the same precision a jeweler applied to a stone of uncertain provenance. She wore ministry robes. He recognized the seal from the Gringotts pamphlets about wizarding government that Hermione had pressed into his hands on the train. Behind her, very discreetly, were 2 people in plainer robes. They were doing the thing where adults tried to look like furniture. Harry looked at all of them. He looked at McGonagall. "Sit down, Harry," McGonagall said, and her voice was the warmest he'd heard it. She gestured at the chair nearest her desk. He sat. "This is Madame Amelia Bones," McGonagall said. "She is the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at the Ministry." She would like to speak with you. Harry looked at Amelia Bones. Hello, he said. She studied him for a moment, the monocle making it seem more pointed than it probably was, and then she sat down in the chair across from him and said, Hello, Mr. Potter. Thank you for coming. Professor McGonagall said to, Harry said. Not really a choice. Something shifted at the corner of Bones's mouth. Fair enough. She leaned forward slightly, forearms on her knees. I want to be very clear with you before we talk. You're not in trouble. You haven't done anything wrong. I'm here because Professor McGonagall had some concerns about you that she passed along to my department, and I'd like to ask you a few questions, but you can tell me to stop at any point, and you can have Professor McGonagall present for all of it, and if there's anything you don't want to answer, you don't have to. Harry considered this. What kind of concerns? Bones glanced briefly at McGonagall, then back at him. The kind a good professor has when she wants to make sure her students are being properly looked after. A pause. You mean the scars, Harry said. Nobody said anything for a moment. It had come out more straightforwardly than he'd intended. He hadn't planned to say it, he'd been watching Bones's face and reading the particular way she was being careful with him, and the conclusion had just arrived. He saw McGonagall's expression shift very slightly, something moving behind her controlled exterior, and he saw Bones straighten, and he thought, I've said a thing. Yes, Bones said, after a moment. Simply. That's part of it. I knew she looked, Harry said. In class. I saw her stop. He looked down at his hands briefly. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Can I ask you about them? Bones said. The scars. Harry shrugged. It was an honest shrug, genuine uncertainty about whether the topic required the formality everyone seemed to be applying to it. Sure. The one on your left forearm, she said, gesturing without touching. Can you tell me how you got it? Harry looked at his forearm. He turned it over, looked at the inside of his wrist, at the stretch of differently textured skin that had been there for as long as he could remember. Long enough that he'd stopped seeing it as a thing with an origin. It was just part of his arm. I don't remember getting it, he said. I think I was maybe 6. 7. I was in the kitchen, he stopped. Reorganized. I was doing the cooking. We have a wood-burning stove at the Dursleys, and the door sticks. When you're closing it after you've put the wood in, you have to push it hard and sometimes your arm goes in further than you meant. He said it the way he'd always said it, in his head, the way he'd filed it. Accident. Kitchen accident. It was an accident. Bones was very still. Did anyone take you to a doctor? Harry looked at her. No, he said. Did anyone treat the burn? My aunt put some, he tried to remember. Something. I don't know what. A cloth. He paused. It was fine. It healed. McGonagall made a sound behind him that was barely a sound at all, a very slight, very controlled exhale, and Harry turned to look at her. Her hands were clasped in her lap. Her face was set in the way a person's face set when they were being extremely professional about something. The marks on your right forearm, Bones said, drawing his attention back. The 2 lines. Harry looked. He hadn't thought about those in a while. Dudley and his friends, he said. His gang, sort of. They used to, he considered the word. Chase me. When we were kids. I fell through a fence once. He checked his own memory, which was, he realized, vague on this specific point. I think it was a fence. Bones wrote something down. She wrote it down carefully, without looking at what she was writing, keeping her eyes on him. Harry, she said, in a different tone, still steady, still professional, but with something else threading through it, how often would you say Dudley and his friends chased you? I don't know, Harry said. Quite a lot when we were younger. Less now, I think. Or I got better at running. He said the last bit without thinking about whether it was funny and then registered that no one was laughing. It was fine, he added, which was something he said often enough that it came out automatic. What does quite a lot mean? He thought about it. Genuinely tried to put a number to it. Most days, he said finally. Most days, Bones repeated. Not every day. But most. Yeah. He shifted. Look, kids chase each other. It's not, did they catch you? He stopped. That was a different question. He sat with it for a moment, and the sitting with it produced a shift in his stomach that was unusual, not the familiar contraction of trouble approaching but something else, something he didn't have a clean name for, like a door to a room he'd kept shut for a long time was being pushed against from the other side. Sometimes, he said. What happened when they caught you? He looked at her. She looked back, steady and even, and he had the peculiar feeling that she already knew the answer and was asking because she wanted him to say it, because saying it out loud was different from her saying it. What you'd expect, he said. I want to hear it in your words. He looked at the fireplace. He thought about editing it, presenting it smaller than it was, the way he'd learned to, not to lie exactly, just to arrange things so they took up less space. He'd become very good at that. It was practical. Adults didn't want to hear certain things, and telling them to adults who then didn't do anything was worse than not telling them, because it added the particular humiliation of being heard and dismissed to the original thing. But Amelia Bones didn't look like she wasn't going to do anything. They'd hit me, he said. Mostly Dudley. He's a lot bigger than me. His friends mostly just, he gestured vaguely. Held me, or stood around. Dudley was the one who'd actually, he stopped. Recalibrated. Said it plainly the way she seemed to want it, he'd hit me in the face, mostly. Or the stomach. He went through a phase with a cricket bat. He heard himself say it and noticed, with detached interest, that his voice was completely even. I got good at running. And good at finding hiding places. The room was very quiet. He turned back from the fireplace and looked at Amelia Bones, who was not writing anything down now. She was just looking at him. Her expression was, he wasn't sure. He'd gotten good at reading adult faces, but this one was something he didn't see often. It wasn't pity, he didn't think, he knew what pity looked like. It was the look some of the teachers at his primary school got sometimes, soft and useless and followed by nothing. This was harder than pity. This was something that had edges. He went through a phase with a cricket bat, she repeated quietly. He's actually gotten less bad as he got older, Harry said, and meant it. When we were small it was worse. Where were your aunt and uncle during this? He looked at her. Honest answer, he thought. She wants honest answers. My uncle, he took a breath. They didn't really, they thought it was fine for Dudley to do things to me that they wouldn't have wanted done to Dudley. That was just, he searched for the word. That was just how it worked. I did things for them, cooking, cleaning, gardening, and they let me live there. That was the arrangement. You were a child, Bones said. Quietly. Matter of fact. I know, Harry said. Then, I know that, in theory. She tilted her head. I know children don't usually, he stopped. Started again. I knew, at school, my primary school, that my life was different from other kids. I worked that out by the time I was 7 or 8. But knowing something's different isn't the same as knowing it's. He looked for the word. Wrong, he said, and the word felt strange in his mouth, not because it was wrong, he was fairly sure it was right, but because he'd never said it in this context out loud before. I didn't know it was wrong. I just knew it was mine. McGonagall made another sound. Harry didn't turn around this time. He felt odd. Not distressed, not exactly. More like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, something so long held that it had stopped feeling like a weight and started feeling like part of his body, and now someone was asking him to set it down, and his hands didn't quite know what to do without it. "The cupboard," Bones said. Very carefully, like she was stepping onto uncertain ice. Harry stiffened slightly. "What about it?" "You slept in a cupboard under the stairs. For approximately 8 years, until you received your Hogwarts letter." He looked at her sharply. "How do you know that?" "My department executed a warrant on the Dursley residence last night," she said. "A team of investigators visited. They made a detailed record of the premises, including what was clearly a child's living space in the understair cupboard, including drawings on the wall at a height consistent with a young child, a small mattress, and various items consistent with long-term habitation." He'd forgotten about the drawings. He'd done those when he was very small, 4 or 5, before he'd understood that asking for paper was a way of getting in trouble. He'd drawn them on the inside of the cupboard wall with a pencil stub he'd found behind the fridge. Something about the detail of that, the investigators seeing those drawings, recording them, produced a very sudden, very unexpected feeling that sat somewhere behind his sternum and didn't have a simple name. "I had the small bedroom eventually," he said. "After I got the letter. They moved me. Before the letter. Before the letter I was in the cupboard." "For how long?" He thought about it. He genuinely didn't know. He didn't have a memory of being anywhere else. "As long as I can remember," he said. "So, I don't know. Maybe since I was a baby? I don't know when they moved me in there." "You don't remember sleeping anywhere else?" "No." She wrote something. She wrote it slowly. "Harry," she said, and she'd stopped saying Mr. Potter at some point, he hadn't noticed when. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no correct answer. I'm not looking for a particular response. I just want to know what you actually think." She paused. "When you were at Privet Drive, did you ever think about leaving?" He considered this seriously. "Where would I have gone?" "That's not quite what I asked. Did I want to leave?" He sat with it. Yeah. Obviously. But wanting to leave somewhere and actually being able to are different, and I was a kid, and I didn't." He paused. "I didn't know there was anywhere else. The Dursleys told me my parents were drunks who died in a car crash and that nobody else wanted me, so." He said it flatly, the way you said a fact you'd been told often enough to have stored it without effect. "I had no reason to think anywhere else would be better." In the corner of his vision he could see one of the 2 quiet ministry people, the woman, write something very quickly on her parchment. "Were they better than that?" he asked, because he'd thought about this since getting his letter, since finding out who his parents were. "My parents." "Very much so," McGonagall said, from behind him, and her voice was rough in a way he hadn't heard before. "They were exceptional people, Harry. They were among the finest students I ever taught, and they gave their lives for you, and the story you were told it was a lie. A deliberate one." He nodded. He'd suspected. But hearing it from her, from someone who had actually known them, who had taught them, produced a warmth under the sadness that was different from the cold fact of their absence. "Okay," he said. Bones looked at him for a long moment. "You're very calm," she said. He looked at her. "Should I be upset?" "Most people would be." "I might be upset later," he said, honestly. "I tend to process things later. My aunt used to say I was emotionally slow." He paused. "I think I'm just methodical." Another pause. "Either that or 11 years of never being allowed to show anything broke something in me, but I'd rather not think about that one yet." Amelia Bones looked at him with an expression that he couldn't name, but that felt, in some strange way, like respect. "Fair enough," she said, using his own words back at him. "Let's come back to it when you're ready." The interview went on for another hour. It was methodical, Bones was thorough in the way that people were thorough when they intended to build something airtight. She asked about specific incidents with precision, noting dates when he could give them and not pressing when he couldn't, working through his life at Privet Drive with the patience of someone who had done this many times and understood that the shape of a thing emerged slowly, from many small details, not from a single dramatic revelation. He told her about the food, the portions, the way food was managed, the distinct hierarchy of who ate what and how much. He told her about the garden, which he'd been working since he was old enough to hold a trowel. He told her about the primary school and the teacher he'd had in year 4 who'd seemed suspicious that he always wore long sleeves, and who had asked him about it once, and to whom he'd said it was nothing, and whom he'd watched do nothing more about it and had drawn the predictable conclusion. He told her, with the same flat matter-of-factness, about the locking mechanism on his door. The cat flap that had been installed. The bars on his window, briefly, one summer. He watched her write all of it down. He didn't watch McGonagall's face during that part. At the end of it, Bones set down her quill, closed her folder, and said, "Harry, I want to tell you what happens from here. Not because you're a child and I need to explain it to you, but because you deserve to know and because I think you should have the information and make your own decisions about how you feel about it." He nodded. The Dursley residence was inspected last night. What we found, combined with what you've told me this morning, is sufficient to pursue a formal case under the Magical Child Protection Act of 1972 and the associated Muggle interface clauses. The Dursleys will be formally interviewed under magical compulsion. Veritaserum, he asked. Something less invasive. But similar in effect. She looked at him steadily. The guardianship arrangement, informal as it was, legally speaking, will be immediately suspended. Petunia and Vernon Dursley will no longer have legal authority over you. He sat with that. Okay, he said. That means we need to establish alternative guardianship, which takes time. In the interim, you are already in residence at Hogwarts, which is legally recognized as a place of care for minors, and Professor McGonagall has agreed to serve as your interim point of contact with the Ministry. He turned to look at McGonagall. She met his gaze without looking away. You told them, he said to her. It wasn't an accusation. He was genuinely, at this moment, simply processing the sequence of events. You saw, and you told them. Yes, she said. She didn't offer qualifications or apologies for it. On Tuesday, he said. Before lunch? She held his gaze. Before lunch, yes. He looked at her for a moment, this very tall, very precise woman in her tartan and her severe bun and her pointed hat that seemed designed to suggest she had no patience for softness, and he thought about her sitting in her classroom on a Tuesday morning and writing a letter before lunch, and the thing behind his sternum that had no name became briefly extremely large and then contracted into something manageable. Right, he said. He looked at his hands. Thank you. Don't thank me, she said, briskly, the way she might say don't be absurd. It should have happened years ago. The thanks you might consider saving for when we've finished doing it properly. He almost smiled. There's one more thing, Bones said. Potentially significant, and I won't discuss it in detail yet because the situation is still being assessed, but there is a possibility that a closer family member may become relevant to the question of your guardianship. Someone with legal precedent and what would appear to be a genuine claim. Harry looked at her. I don't have any other family. The Dursleys always said, the Dursleys, Bones said, with a precision that made the words feel like a surgical cut, were not reliable sources of information about you or your life. That's becoming increasingly clear. She stood. Leave that with me for now. It may come to nothing, or it may be quite significant. Either way, you'll be the first to know. She offered her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who meant what they said. One more question, Harry said, as she turned toward the door. The Dursleys, are they going to get in trouble? Like, actual trouble? Bones turned back. She looked at him with the monocle and the sharp eyes and the expression that had edges. "Yes," she said. "They are." He nodded slowly. And here was the thing he hadn't expected about himself, the thing he noted with distant curiosity: he didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel the satisfaction he might have imagined, on the rare occasions he'd imagined such a scenario at all. He felt clean, he thought. Like a window opened. "Okay," he said. "Good." He walked back to class. Transfiguration, as it happened. He was 3 minutes late, slipping in the back while McGonagall's chair was still empty at the front. She'd stayed behind to speak with Bones further, and he slid into his seat while Hermione shot him a look that contained a minimum of 17 questions she was physically preventing herself from asking. He gave her a small nod that meant later, and she gave him a look that meant "I will hold you to that," and he turned to his desk. On it was a matchstick. He looked at it. He picked it up and set it in front of him and held it between 2 fingers, the way he had on Tuesday, and he thought about what Bones had said, no longer have legal authority, and he thought about McGonagall writing a letter before noon on a Tuesday because she'd looked at his arms for 3 seconds, and he thought about his parents, who had been exceptional people, and who had died so he could be here. He looked at the matchstick. He thought, "I'm not going to be afraid of this." Not this, meaning the matchstick. This, meaning everything. The scale of what was in motion, the uncertainty of guardianship and investigation, and the thing Bones had hinted at, a family member, closer, and Hogwarts itself with its moving staircases and its ghosts and its extraordinary normalness, and the future that was unrolling ahead of him like a map of a country he'd never visited. He wasn't afraid of any of it. He'd been afraid for 11 years and it hadn't helped even slightly, and here was a woman who'd written a letter before noon, and here was his matchstick. He focused. The matchstick turned silver. All of it. Tip to base, in approximately 3 seconds, the wood resolving into polished metal, a perfect needle lying in his palm, cold and bright and real. He looked at it. He turned it over. He heard the desk beside him make a very small, choked sound, and he looked up to find Hermione staring at his hand with an expression she only got when confronted with something she categorized as both impossible and deeply impressive simultaneously. Ron, on his other side, had his mouth open. Harry set the needle down on the desk. "Don't," he said, to both of them, without heat. "I wasn't going to say anything," Ron said. "You were going to say something." "I was going to say," the door opened. McGonagall walked in. She went directly to the front, deployed her professional exterior with the efficiency of someone putting on armor, and said, "Right. Matchsticks. Let's see where everyone is." Her eyes moved across the room in the brisk, cataloging sweep Harry was already starting to recognize as her classroom mode. When her gaze reached him, it stopped for exactly half a second on the needle sitting silver on his desk. She looked at his face. He looked back at hers. Something passed between them, small and precise and not quite a smile on either side but in the same family, and then she moved her gaze to the next desk and said, "Weasley, I can see from here that your matchstick has not improved since Tuesday. Tell me what you've been doing wrong and don't guess." Ron launched into a fairly accurate self-assessment, which suggested he'd actually read the chapter, and McGonagall listened with the focused patience of a woman who had other things on her mind and was channeling them into being an excellent teacher. Harry turned the needle over in his fingers. It caught the light, cold and silver and sharply real. He thought about the closest family member Bones had mentioned. He thought about the word significant. He had no framework for imagining who it might be. He was genuinely, completely without a map on that particular question. The thought didn't frighten him. It made him curious. He set the needle down. He paid attention to the class. He was discovering, very good at Transfiguration, which McGonagall confirmed at the end of the period with a brief, "Well done, Mr. Potter," that carried, he thought, about 15 other sentences inside it that she'd elected not to say in class. He caught up with Ron and Hermione in the corridor. "Okay, Hermione said, with barely controlled urgency. Tell us. Later, he said. Harry, at dinner, he said. I need to think about it first. She looked like this was physically painful to her, which was something he was already becoming fond of. Fine, she said. Also, Ron said, with exquisite casualness, the needle thing. What about it? You did it on your first, in one go. Ron ran a hand through his hair. Can you do it again? Harry pulled the needle out of his pocket and set it on his palm. Would, he thought. Then he thought, actually, stay silver. It's better silver. The needle stayed silver. He put it back. Show off, Ron said, but he was grinning. You said not to hide it, Harry told him. I haven't said anything yet today. You were thinking it. They went to Charms. Harry walked between them, through the shifting staircases that might or might not have personalities, through the extraordinary impossible normalness of this place, and he felt the thing behind his sternum, the thing without a name, settle into something new. It felt, he thought, like the weight of a cupboard door that had been finally, properly opened. Not fixed. Not finished. Just, open. And daylight coming in. Chapter 3, The Reckoning. The Owl found Vernon Dursley at 7:30 on a Thursday evening. He was in his armchair, watching the news, a glass of scotch balanced on the arm, Dudley on the floor with his video game making the kind of electronic warfare sounds that Vernon had stopped registering about 2 years ago. Petunia was in the kitchen. The house smelled of the lamb chops they'd had for dinner and the particular settled stillness of a home that had been organized, for years, around the comfort of 3 specific people. The owl came through the kitchen window. Petunia screamed. Vernon was on his feet before he'd fully processed why, scotch sloshing over his hand, and then he saw it, the bird, large and official-looking, perched on the kitchen counter with a letter in its talons that was sealed with a wax stamp he recognized with the dropping sensation of a man who had spent 10 years hoping very hard to never see that stamp again. Ministry of Magic. Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Get that thing out of my house, he said. Petunia had backed against the refrigerator. She was looking at the seal. Vernon, it's nothing, he said. They send letters, that's what they do, it's nothing, Petunia, but his hands weren't steady when he took the letter. The owl departed without being offered anything, which struck some small, detached part of Vernon as ominous. Owls in his limited experience expected treats, and an owl that didn't wait for a treat was an owl that had been sent on business rather than courtesy. He opened the letter. He read it. He read it again. The color left his face in stages, the way it left a room when someone turned off lights one by one. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, you are hereby notified that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, in conjunction with the Department of Magical Child Welfare, has opened a formal inquiry into the care and well-being of Harry James Potter, a minor in your guardianship, pursuant to the Magical Child Protection Act of 1972 and associated Muggle interface provisions. Ministry investigators conducted an inspection of your premises on the evening of September 3, 1991. Further investigation is ongoing. You are required to present yourselves for formal interview at the Ministry of Magic, London, on Saturday, September 7th, at 10 o'clock in the morning. Failure to appear will result in the issuance of a compulsory appearance warrant, enforceable by or escort. Please be aware that testimony given at this interview will be taken under magical compulsion and will be admissible before the Wisengamot. Yours, Amelia S. Bones, Head, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Vernon set the letter on the kitchen counter. He was aware, in a distant way, that Petunia had come forward and was reading it over his shoulder, and that Dudley had wandered in from the lounge following the sound of his mother's earlier scream, and was standing in the kitchen doorway eating a biscuit with the unconcerned expression of a boy who had never been asked to worry about consequences for anything. What does it mean? Petunia said. Her voice was a different texture than usual. Thinner. It means, Vernon said, and then stopped, because the full shape of what it meant was assembling itself in his mind and the assembly was not pleasant. It means the boy has said something. We don't know that, there were people here, Petunia. He turned to look at her. In this house. On Wednesday night. While someone was in this house, they inspected. He stopped at the expression on her face. Did you see anyone? No, she said. Too quickly. Petunia. Her jaw set. I heard something, she said, quietly. Wednesday, around 11. I thought it was the cat. It wasn't the cat. They looked at each other across the kitchen, and Dudley finished his biscuit and looked between them with the instinct of a boy who had learned to read the room when bad things were being decided. Is this about Harry? He asked. Neither of his parents answered, which was an answer. Dudley looked at the letter on the counter. He couldn't read the seal from where he was standing, but he could read his parents' faces, which were doing something he didn't see them do often, something that looked, under the bluster and the thinness, very much like fear. He went back to his video game. He played it for another 20 minutes, and he thought, with a clarity unusual for Dudley Dursley, about a boy who could find hiding places fast. About a boy who could run. He didn't examine the thoughts too closely. But they were there. Saturday morning. Ministry of Magic. The visitor entrance on the Muggle side was a telephone box on a side street in London that looked like it had been there since the 60s and smelled like it too. Vernon Dursley stood in front of it in his best suit, the one he wore to important meetings at Grunnings, the suit that had been purchased specifically to communicate authority and respectability. And he looked at the telephone box and he hated it with the complete and irrational intensity of a man who had spent his entire adult life insisting that certain things did not exist and was now standing in front of evidence to the contrary. We don't have to do this, he said. Failure to appear will result in Auror escort, Petunia said, reading from the letter she'd folded into her handbag and retrieved 4 times on the train. Vernon, I don't want Aurors coming to Privet Drive. He didn't want that either. The neighbors. He went in first. Petunia followed. They dialed the number on the handset and went down. The ministry atrium was, Vernon thought, designed to be as offensive as possible to someone like him. The ceiling was too high. The decor was too, the word he was looking for was assured, the unconcerned confidence of a space that had been here since before he was born and expected to be here long after. Wizards moved around them with the ease of people entirely at home, and the Dursleys stood in the middle of it in their respectable Muggle clothes and were, for the first time in their lives, the smallest people in the room. A ministry official met them at the atrium, a young man with a clipboard and a pleasant expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. He led them to level 2, through corridors that Harry could have told them smelled of old parchment and something electrical that wasn't electricity, and into a room that was plainly a conference room but had the particular quality of rooms where official things happened, neutral colors, a table, chairs, a recording orb on the table that glowed faintly amber. 2 Aurors stood at the back of the room. Not aggressively. Just, there. Vernon looked at the Aurors and felt the suit do less work than he'd hoped. Amelia Bones came in last. She sat across from them, opened a folder, and looked at them both with the monocle and the expression that Harry had correctly identified as having edges. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, she said. Thank you for coming. I'll explain how this works. The recording orb on the table creates a transcript that is admissible before the Wisengamot. Before we begin, you'll each consume a small potion, not Veritaserum, which requires a judicial order we haven't sought, but a compulsion aid that inhibits deliberate deception. It doesn't compel you to speak. It simply prevents you from lying when you do. Vernon opened his mouth. It's not optional, she said, before he got a word out. A small vial appeared in front of each of them. Vernon looked at his. Petunia looked at hers. The Aurors at the back did not move but became, somehow, slightly more present. They drank. It tasted, Vernon thought, like nothing. Like water. That was somehow worse than if it had tasted like something. Good, Bones said. Now. Let's start from the beginning. She was thorough. She asked about Harry's arrival at Privet Drive, the circumstances, their reaction, whether they had been given any choice in the matter. She asked about the sleeping arrangements, going back to infancy, working forward through the years. She asked about meals. She asked about school. She asked, with a precision that made Petunia's hands grip the edge of the table, about medical care. And the thing about the compulsion aid was that it worked exactly as advertised. It didn't force speech. Vernon could remain silent on a question. But when he spoke, and he was a man who filled silences as a reflex, who blustered as naturally as breathing, what came out was true. He tried, once, to say that Harry had been treated the same as Dudley. His mouth didn't finish the sentence. He sat there for a moment with the unfinished sentence in the air and the Aurors at the back and Amelia Bones looking at him, and Petunia looking at the table, and he tried a different approach. The boy was difficult, he said. Strange things happened around him, accidental magic, Bones said. Yes. That's normal for magical children. Did you know that when you took him in? Dumbledore left a letter. Did the letter explain that accidental magic was a normal developmental phenomenon for magical children and not a sign of bad character? Vernon paused. Yes. And your response was to punish him when it occurred. He tried to frame this differently. The compulsion aid let him be selective in what he said but not in whether what he said was true, and the combination produced a kind of horrible precision. He could choose his words, but the words he chose kept being accurate. We didn't understand it, Petunia said. They both looked at her. She hadn't spoken much, sitting very still with her thin hands folded, looking at the table. Now she looked up, and she looked at Bones, and something in her face had shifted into a territory Vernon hadn't seen her in before. Not guilt exactly. More like a person who had been handed a mirror they'd avoided looking into for 9 years. We were frightened of it, she said. He could do things we couldn't explain, and we were frightened, and, she stopped. And you punished him for frightening you, Bones said. Petunia didn't answer. The cupboard, Bones said. She said it the way you placed a card on a table. Petunia closed her eyes. He was a baby, she said. When Dumbledore left him. We didn't know what to, she stopped again. Restarted. I was scared. I had Dudley, and Dudley was normal, and Harry was, she pressed her lips together. He wasn't like Dudley. He was like Lily. I could see it in him from the beginning. And her voice went very thin. I couldn't. The room was very quiet. Couldn't what? Bones said. Love him, Petunia said. The word fell into the room like something dropped from a height. I couldn't love him the way I should have. He looked like her, and she'd left me behind, she'd gone off into their world and she'd been killed, and there was her son, and I couldn't, she exhaled. So I kept him safe. I made sure he was fed and housed and clothed because he was Lily's son and she stopped. But it wasn't enough. I know it wasn't enough. It was, Vernon thought, the most honest he had ever heard his wife be about anything. He sat in his chair in his good suit and he felt very strange. The recording orb glowed. The scars, Bones said. Gently, clinically. Some of them were accidents, Petunia said. Genuinely. He was always doing things, climbing, running. He was always hurt. We didn't, she paused. We didn't always take him to the doctor because we didn't want questions. And the ones that weren't accidents. Silence. Vernon, Petunia said. Vernon looked at his hands. He thought about the boy doing things that scared him. He thought about the time the incident with the glass at the zoo, before the boy had even started his odd school, before any of it had been made explicit, the glass just vanishing, the snake. He thought about the instinctive, furious terror of something you couldn't control or explain existing in your house and wearing the face of your wife's dead sister's child and looking at you with those eyes. He made me angry, Vernon said. Flat. True. The compulsion aid sitting in his chest like a small, honest fire. He made me very angry, and there were times when I wasn't. I was not always. Did you physically harm the child? Bones said. Vernon Dursley sat for a moment in the most important suit he owned in the most important room he'd ever been in, and the compulsion aid in his chest burned quietly, and he said, yes. On more than one occasion. Yes. The recording orb had been glowing amber throughout. It was, Vernon realized, the exact color of the scotch he'd been holding when the owl arrived on Thursday. He thought about Harry Potter on the floor of Privet Drive with scuffed knees and that particular expression that Vernon had. He could see it now, could see it clearly in a way that he hadn't allowed himself to see at the time, that particular blank, composed expression that a child wore when they'd learned that expressing pain made things worse. He thought about that expression. He sat very still. Right, said Amelia Bones. She closed her folder with the finality of a magistrate closing a judgment. Here is where we are. The guardianship arrangement for Harry Potter is terminated, effective immediately, as of the ministry ruling issued on Thursday. You will not contest this. We don't, Vernon began. You will not contest this, she said again, and her voice was not loud but was the kind of voice that had never once in its life needed to be loud to be absolute. You will surrender any remaining documentation pertaining to Harry Potter, his birth certificate, any medical records, any correspondence, to this office by Monday. You are not to attempt to contact him. You are not to present yourselves at Hogwarts School. You are not to speak to the press about this matter in any capacity. She paused. As to criminal charges, she said, the investigation is ongoing. The decision about prosecution will be made when the investigation is complete. That decision is not mine alone, it will involve the Wisengamot. I will tell you this, the fact that you appeared today, cooperated, and gave truthful testimony will be noted. It does not erase the record. But it will be noted. She stood. We're done for today, she said. The young man with the clipboard will see you out. She walked to the door, opened it, and paused. Mrs. Dursley, she said, without turning around. You said you kept him safe. I want you to consider, very carefully, what that word means, and whether you can, with full honesty, say it applied. She left. The Dursleys sat in the room with the recording orb, and the horrors, and the quiet that followed the close of a door that would not open again in the same way. Petunia Dursley pressed her hands flat on the table, and she looked at them, and she said nothing at all. Harry didn't know any of this was happening Saturday morning because Saturday morning he was at breakfast arguing about Quidditch. This was remarkable mostly because he'd barely known Quidditch existed a week ago, but Ron had spent approximately 4 combined hours over the previous 3 days educating him, and the education had produced a strong and immediate opinion about chaser formations that Harry couldn't entirely justify with his limited knowledge but felt intuitively certain about. The arrows use a triangular formation in the second half, he said. I read it in Quidditch Through the Ages. Hermione had it. You borrowed my book to read about Quidditch? Hermione said. You have every book, Harry pointed out. That's not what books are for information, Harry said. That was information. Triangular formation, Ron. The diamond setup leaves the keeper exposed on the diamond setup is classic, Ron said, with the conviction of someone whose entire family tree was made of Quidditch opinion. 6 Weasley brothers, Harry. I've been hearing about formations since before I could walk. And yet, Harry said. I feel like this argument is going to keep happening, Hermione said, to no one in particular. It did keep happening, all the way through breakfast and partway through the morning, until McGonagall appeared at the Gryffindor table with a note that she placed beside Harry's pumpkin juice without ceremony. He looked at it. Looked at her. No urgency, she said, again, like last time, like she'd noticed that he needed to hear that and was going to keep saying it until it stopped being necessary. Finish what you're doing. Come to my office when you're ready. She walked away. Ron was watching. Third time in a week. Fourth, Hermione corrected. I'm not counting Thursdays, I am. Harry opened the note. Harry, Amelia Bones has asked me to speak with you this afternoon regarding the outcome of today's interviews. There is also a separate matter she wishes to discuss, which I believe will be significant. Come when you're ready. Professor McGonagall. He read it twice. The word significant had been underlined. He thought about Bones, in the interview, saying a family member, closer. He thought about the way she'd said potentially significant, careful and measured, the voice of someone with information they weren't ready to release yet. He folded the note. Put it in his pocket. Picked up his pumpkin juice. Well? Ron said. She wants to see me. About? Not sure. He drank his juice. He was being honest, he wasn't completely sure, and the part he suspected he was going to sit with for another 20 minutes before he went up. He wanted to eat the rest of his breakfast. He wanted to sit in the ordinary noise of this hall, the way he had every morning for a week now, with the ceiling showing the sky and the food appearing and no one managing his portions. He ate. He let Ron and Hermione argue about something else. He let the hall noise wash over him. Then he went. McGonagall's office had flames going when he arrived, which was different from his previous visits. She was standing near the fireplace, and there was a warm but concentrated focus about her, the look of a woman who had been managing several things at once and had organized them all into a sequence. Sit down, she said. He sat. He noticed she didn't offer the chair across the desk this time, the same chair as before, the interview chair. She gestured at a different one, angled toward the fireplace, the one with the tartan cushion. He sat in the tartan cushion chair. She sat across from him, not behind the desk but in the matching chair, which put them level rather than positioned. The interviews happened this morning, she said. The Dursleys attended. The outcome was as expected, their guardianship is terminated, they are under investigation, and the documentation requirements have been set. She paused. How are you with that? Fine, he said. Harry. Really fine, he said. Not performing fine. I keep waiting to feel something dramatic about it, and I don't. It just feels like something that was going to happen has happened. She looked at him for a moment. That may change. It might, he said. I'll handle it then. She nodded, like this was an acceptable answer. He appreciated that she didn't push for more. The separate matter, she said. She paused. I want to give you context first, because the context matters and I want you to have it before you hear the name. She folded her hands. When your parents were killed in 1981, your father's closest friend, his best friend, a man named Sirius Black, was arrested by ministry orders the following day and taken to Azkaban prison. Harry went still. He was accused of betraying your parents' location to Voldemort, she continued. He was accused of killing 12 Muggles in the street outside their homes. He was given no trial. A beat. No trial? Harry said. No trial, she confirmed, and the flatness of her voice on those two words told him what she thought of that. He was taken directly to Azkaban on the testimony of one witness and the assumption of guilt. He has been there for 10 years. Harry looked at her. Was he guilty? That is, the question Amelia Bones is now asking, McGonagall said carefully. His case has been formally reopened as part of this inquiry, because it became apparent when the investigation began that Sirius Black is, legally, your godfather. Named in your parents' will. Which means he has a legitimate claim to your guardianship, if he can be established as innocent, or, more accurately, if his conviction can be identified as the legal void it was, given that there was no trial. The room was very quiet. My godfather, Harry said. Yes. He's been in Azkaban for 10 years. Yes. He let that sit. He turned it over carefully, the way he turned the needle over in his fingers, something that needed to be examined from all sides before conclusions were drawn. You said the case has been reopened. Does that mean they think he might not have done it? Amelia Bones thinks the original arrest was conducted improperly regardless of guilt, McGonagall said. A man imprisoned without trial has a legal right to one regardless of the evidence. However, she paused. There are aspects of the case that she finds inconsistent. I won't go into the details because they're not fully assembled yet, and I would rather give you information when it's complete than speculation that turns out to be wrong. But she thinks there's something, Harry said. She thinks it's worth looking at very closely, McGonagall said. Yes. He nodded slowly. I need to ask you something, she said. And I want you to answer honestly, not the way you think I want you to answer. Okay. How do you feel about the possibility of Sirius Black becoming your guardian? Not as a fait accompli, it's not decided, there are many steps, there are investigations that need to conclude. But, the concept. How does it land? He thought about it. He thought about the Dursleys. He thought about Privet Drive and the cupboard and the garden and the long corridors of years that had just been, abruptly, on a Tuesday morning in September, ended. He thought about living somewhere again, eventually, somewhere that would need to be decided. I don't know him, he said. No. He could be terrible. He could, she agreed. Did you know him? A pause. I taught him, she said. 30 years ago. He was, she seemed to select her words. Brilliant. Reckless in a way that was irritating to teach but impossible not to admire. Extraordinarily loyal. She paused. He loved your father like a brother. He loved your mother, too, I think, as a sister, eventually, after he got over being an idiot about her in second year. Harry almost smiled. Typical. Extremely. Something in her expression softened, briefly. He was not a man I could imagine betraying James Potter. That was always, she stopped. That was always what troubled me about the accusation. But I am a Transfiguration teacher, not an Auror, and my instincts about character are not evidence. What does he look like? She blinked slightly. I'm sorry. Sirius Black. What does he look like? He paused. I've seen the Dursleys' faces my whole life. I'd like to know what his looks like. She studied him for a moment with something he was beginning to recognize as her version of being moved by something, a very controlled, very interior version, like everything was processed through 3 layers of professionalism before it reached the surface. She reached into her desk drawer and produced a photograph. She handed it to him. It was a wizarding photograph, he was getting used to those, of a group of young people, outdoor, somewhere sunny, laughing at something off camera. She pointed to a man, second from the left, tall, dark-haired, with a wide grin and the kind of easy confidence that some people were born with and others spent their lives attempting to acquire. Handsome in a way that seemed entirely incidental to him. He had his arm around a shorter man with messy hair and glasses. Harry looked at the shorter man with the messy hair and the glasses. His throat did something. That's my dad, he said. Yes. He looked at his father's face, laughing, alive, young, here, real in a way no photograph could fully deliver but trying its best, and he looked at Sirius Black's arm around his father's shoulders, casual and permanent and completely unaware that 10 years later this moment would be all that was left. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He handed it back. Keep it, she said. He looked at her. It's a copy, she said, in her most professional tone, the one she used when she was offering something that she didn't want him to make a fuss about. I have the original. That one's yours. He put it in his pocket with the note. Thank you, he said. Don't, she began. I know, he said. I know. But I'm going to anyway. She pressed her lips together, which was, he was learning, the McGonagall version of a smile. "Very well," she said. "Just this once." He stood. He was almost at the door when he turned. "Professor," he said. "The blood protection, the reason Dumbledore put me with the Dursleys. It was real, wasn't it? It actually did something." She met his gaze. "It kept you alive," she said. "Which it did." "Yes. So he wasn't wrong to care about that." "No," she said carefully. "He wasn't wrong to care about your survival. The method he chose to ensure it required more," she paused. "More than it should have required of you. That distinction matters." He nodded. "I'm not angry at him," he said. "I keep waiting to be and I'm not. I just want to understand it." "That's very mature of you," she said. "Or I'm still processing," he said. "Possibly both. Probably both." He opened the door. "Can I ask you something else?" "Yes." "Are you my guardian?" "Right now, technically, interim, are you the one?" She held his gaze steadily. "Interim, yes. Until the matter of Sirius Black is resolved, which may take weeks or months, I am your listed point of contact and responsible adult with the Ministry." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Right," he said. "Good." He walked out. He went down the corridor, and then down the stairs, and then he found a windowsill on the third floor that had a view of the grounds and the lake and the far edge of the forest, and he sat on it, and he took the photograph out of his pocket. His dad, and Sirius Black, and two others he didn't know. Laughing at something he would never know what it was. Young and alive and completely without the knowledge of what was coming. He looked at his dad's face for a long time. Then he looked at the lake. A giant squid tentacle was doing something languid near the surface. The sky had gone the particular pale gold of a Saturday afternoon, low sun, long shadows. His name was Harry Potter. He was 11 years old. He had a godfather in Azkaban and a photograph in his pocket and scars on his arms and a perfect silver needle somewhere in his dormitory. He had two friends who would argue about Quidditch with him and a head of house who had written a letter before noon on a Tuesday because she'd looked at his arms for 3 seconds and refused to look away. The Dursleys were being investigated. Their guardianship was done. The arrangement that had defined the entire geography of his life had been dismantled by a woman who had noticed something and acted on it with no hesitation and no apology. He sat with all of this. He felt, underneath everything, something that wasn't happiness exactly but was in the same territory, something forward-facing and clear and surprisingly unafraid. He put the photograph back in his pocket. He went to find Ron and Hermione. They were by the lake, which was where they seemed to gravitate on free afternoons, and Ron was throwing stones at the squid tentacle in a half-hearted way and Hermione was pretending not to be watching to see if the squid would react, which it wasn't, and they both looked up when he arrived. He sat down on the grass. "So?" Ron said. "I have a godfather," Harry said. Ron blinked. "He's in Azkaban," Harry continued. "Oh," said Ron. "But that might be wrong," Harry said. "He might not have done what they said he did. They're looking into it." "Who is it?" Hermione asked. She had the voice of someone filtering an enormous number of questions to identify which one was most relevant. "Sirius Black," Harry said. The silence that followed was a very particular shape. Ron's stone stopped halfway to the water. "Sirius Black," he said. "Like, Sirius Black? Is there another one?" "Harry," Ron looked genuinely uncertain, which was unusual for him. "My mum talks about Sirius Black." Not in a, he searched for words. "She doesn't talk about him like someone who might be innocent." "No one does," Harry said. "That's the problem." He picked up a stone. Turned it over. But no one gave him a trial, either. And McGonagall says she never quite believed it. McGonagall? Hermione said. She taught him. 30 years ago. Harry looked at the water. She says he was brilliant and reckless and loyal, and she couldn't imagine him doing it. Teachers are wrong about students sometimes, Hermione said carefully. Not dismissively, carefully. Giving the information its fair weight. Yeah, Harry said. But Bones, the ministry woman, she's reopening the case. She thinks there's something off about the original investigation. The squid tentacles slid below the surface. Ron sat down next to Harry on the grass. Hermione was already sitting on his other side. The three of them looked at the lake, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the water, and the castle rose behind them with all its extraordinary weight of history and stone. If he's innocent, Ron said, what happens? He gets out, Harry said. And he'd be my guardian. He paused. I'd have somewhere to go. Ron looked at him. The look had a specific quality to it, the quality of a boy who had never, for a single day of his life, not had somewhere to go, and who was only now fully understanding what that meant. Right, he said. Right, Harry agreed. Hermione reached over and tucked her hand briefly around Harry's wrist, not over the scars, he noticed. She put her hand just above them, on the inside of his forearm, brief and warm, and then she pulled it back and straightened up and said, in her most normal voice, so. Quidditch formations. Harry, tell me more about this triangular setup because I need to know if your argument actually holds, and Ron keeps being evasive about the specifics. Ron looked scandalized. I'm not being evasive, you've said, it's classic, 4 times without explaining what that means. Harry looked at both of them. He felt the forward-facing thing in his chest. He felt the lake and the light and the stone at his back and the photograph in his pocket. He started explaining the triangular formation. Ron immediately objected. Hermione immediately began fact-checking both of them. The afternoon stretched out long and golden, and somewhere in London, Amelia Bones was reading a case file on Sirius Black that was going to keep her awake until 4 in the morning, and in Dumbledore's office, a long and difficult letter was being composed, and on Privet Drive, Petunia Dursley was standing in the kitchen looking at the counter where the owl had landed, and in Azkaban, in a cell made of cold stone and colder despair, a gaunt man with wild dark hair and grey eyes that had once been brilliant and reckless and full of laughter sat against a wall and knew something had changed, the way you knew things in a place like that, not through information, but through the change in the quality of the dark, and for the first time in 10 years, he did not know what it meant, only that it was different. Different was not nothing. Different was, against all probability, something like hope. Chapter 4, The New Shape of Things. 3 weeks into term, and Hogwarts had begun to understand that something was different about Harry Potter. Not in any way they could have articulated precisely. It wasn't that he was louder or more visible in the way that fame usually made people loud and visible. He didn't seek attention, didn't perform for the people who stared at his forehead in the corridors. But there was something in how he moved through the castle that had shifted from those first bewildered days when he'd arrived not knowing platform 9 3/4 from a hole in the ground. He walked like someone who had decided to take up the space he occupied. That was the best way to describe it. He didn't swagger. He didn't posture. He simply stopped apologizing for being in a room, stopped making himself small at the edges of things, stopped the reflexive flinch when a teacher's voice went sharp or a door slammed nearby. The flinch had been there in week 1, subtle, quick, gone almost before it registered, but McGonagall had clocked it, and so had Hermione, who clocked most things. By week 3, it was mostly gone. What replaced it was a kind of steady attention. He watched everything. He absorbed everything. He asked questions in class without raising his hand in the tentative, please don't notice me way that some students had, but not in the performance way either. He asked because he wanted to know the answer, and the distinction was clear in how he listened to the response. His magic had opinions. That was the phrase Flitwick used, to himself, in the privacy of his own office, the second week of charms. The boy's magic has opinions. Most first-years came to magic the way they came to a new language, carefully, practicing conjugations, checking pronunciation. Harry Potter came to magic the way a person came to their mother tongue. He didn't always get the technique right immediately, but when he did get it right, there was nothing tentative about it. The magic didn't trickle, it arrived. The Wingardium Leviosa incident was a good example. Flitwick had demonstrated the swish and flick 3 times, which was his standard, and set them loose on their feathers. Most students produced minor levitation effects by the end of the class, some produced nothing, some produced uncontrolled bouncing. Longbottom produced a feather that shot to the ceiling and adhered there and required a ladder to retrieve. Hermione's feather rose smoothly to exactly the height Flitwick had specified, which he recognized as the result of her having read 3 chapters ahead and practiced the wand movement during breakfast, which he chose to find admirable rather than alarming. Harry's feather rose to the correct height, hovered, and then, without any additional wand movement, without any apparent additional effort, just a slight shift in his expression, rotated slowly in the air, once, precisely, like a compass finding north. "I didn't do that," Harry said, to Flitwick's raised eyebrow. "Didn't you?" Flitwick said. Harry looked at the feather. "I was thinking about it turning," he said. "I didn't move my wand." Said Flitwick. He made a note. He had been making a great many notes. Ron had looked at the rotating feather, looked at Harry, and said, "Could you teach me that?" "I didn't do it on purpose," Harry said. "Yeah, but could you do it on purpose?" Harry looked at the feather. "Probably," he said, as though this was a reasonable and straightforward answer, which, Flitwick thought, coming from this particular child, it might very well be. Draco Malfoy had been watching Harry Potter for 3 weeks. This was not something he would have admitted to anyone, including himself, framed in those terms. He would have said he was keeping an eye on the situation, which was a phrase his father used when he wanted to observe something without committing to a response. Lucius Malfoy kept eyes on situations constantly. It was a political skill, knowing which way things were moving before you decided where to stand. Draco had his father's instincts, if not always his patience. What he'd observed in 3 weeks was this: Harry Potter was not what he'd expected. He'd expected the boy from the robe shop, a bit overwhelmed, not knowing about pure-blood families, clearly going to need shepherding into understanding how things worked. He'd been prepared to do that shepherding. He'd been prepared to be generous about it, in the way his father was generous when it was strategic to be generous. Potter didn't know anything about their world, Draco did. That was leverage, if handled correctly. What he'd gotten instead was a boy who turned matchsticks to silver on his first try, who argued about Quidditch with the confidence of someone who'd been watching it for years, who sat at meals with Weasley and Granger and looked, not grateful to be there, not performing belonging, just, actually there, actually present, in a way that was quietly, specifically irritating. The corridor incident didn't help. Week 2, Tuesday, between Charms and Transfiguration, Draco had made a comment. Not a particularly severe one. He'd been building up to things, testing edges, seeing where the give was. He'd said something about Weasley's robes, which were objectively secondhand, and something about how some people just didn't belong in certain places, and he'd watched Potter's face for the flinch he'd seen in first years when this particular technique was applied. Potter had looked at him. Not with anger, not with the wide-eyed hurt of someone hit unexpectedly. He'd looked at him the way you looked at a problem that was beneath your current level but still technically required solving. "Are you finished?" he said. Draco blinked. Because if you've got something worth saying, I'm listening, but if you're just going to make comments about Ron's clothes, I'd rather get to class." He looked at Draco with those bright green eyes and said it in a tone that was so entirely without heat that it was more deflating than anger would have been. "You've been doing this for 2 weeks and it's not really working, so you might want to try something different." He walked past. Weasley, following, gave Draco a look that was purely Weasley, straightforward and uncomplicated and completely unafraid, and Granger didn't look at him at all, which was its own comment. Draco stood in the corridor and felt something he wasn't accustomed to feeling, which was that he had miscalculated. He went home for the weekend at the end of week 2, a quick Floo'd trip, his father's standing arrangement with Dumbledore for Malfoy children, and he sat across from Lucius at dinner and thought about how to frame what he was seeing. "Potter," his father said, over the pheasant, before Draco had brought it up. "Tell me about Potter." Draco looked at his father. Lucius was cutting his pheasant with the precise, unhurried attention he gave to everything, leisure as a form of control, time as something you owned rather than were subject to. He didn't look up. "He's not what I expected," Draco said. "Elaborate." "He's not grateful," Draco said, reaching for the word that felt most accurate. "The other Muggleborns, the ones who didn't know anything about our world, they come in either overwhelmed or overcompensating. Potter doesn't do either. He thought about the corridor. He just is." Lucius set down his knife. He looked at Draco with gray eyes that were his son's gray eyes. "And the ministry situation?" Draco hadn't known about the ministry situation until his father mentioned it, which confirmed that his father had sources in the ministry, which he'd always suspected. "I heard there was something. An inquiry into his living arrangements with the Muggles," Lucius said. "McGonagall filed a complaint. Bones opened a case. The guardianship has been terminated." He picked up his wine. "And Sirius Black's case has been reopened." The dining room was very quiet. The candles over the table burned steadily. "Black," Draco said carefully. "Your father's associate," Lucius said, with a precision that stripped the word of warmth. "From school. The traitor." A pause. "Or apparently, possibly, not." Draco studied his father's face. He'd gotten good at reading it over 12 years. What he read now was not concern exactly, but the specific, contained attention his father gave to things that were rearranging themselves in ways that required recalculation. "If Black gets out," Draco said slowly, "and becomes Potter's guardian, then Potter has a home," Lucius said. "And an adult in his corner who knows our world, who knows our people, who knows exactly who in this society has been on which side of history." He set down his wine. Sirius Black was many things, but he was not uninformed. And Potter, with that behind him instead of a cupboard in Surrey, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Draco understood his father well enough to translate the silence. "The plan changes." What plan, exactly, Draco was not entirely sure. There were things his father didn't tell him because he was 12 and because some things were not told, only gradually learned. But he understood the broad shape of it, the old alliances, the old power structures, the families that had been waiting for 15 years for something that had not happened yet but would. And in that structure, Harry Potter as a confused and isolated boy with no one in his corner and a scar on his forehead was one thing. Harry Potter with a godfather and a deputy headmistress and Amelia Bones was something else entirely. "What should I do?" Draco asked. His father looked at him for a moment. "Watch," he said. "Carefully. Don't commit to anything. The board is still being set up." He paused. "And don't antagonize him." Draco thought about the corridor. "Right," he said. He went back to Hogwarts on Sunday and he watched more carefully and he was significantly more thoughtful about what he said in corridors. The other thing that happened in week 3 was that Quirrell dropped something in the corridor outside the third-floor bathroom. Harry had been on his way to the library. Hermione had identified 3 books she needed and sent him a list because she had a charm study session she couldn't miss, which Harry thought said a great deal about her priorities, and he was passing the third-floor corridor with the list in his hand when Professor Quirrell came around the corner at speed, arms full of books and scrolls, the purple turban slightly askew, and dropped everything. Harry bent down to help pick it up. He handed back a scroll, and then a book, and then another book, and then his hand landed on a piece of parchment that had slid further along the floor, and he picked it up and glanced at it automatically, the way you glanced at things when you picked them up, and saw a hand-drawn diagram that he didn't understand. A circular diagram with measurements and what looked like architectural notations and a label at the top that read 3rd floor east, structural layout, including sub-level access. Quirrell took it from his hand very quickly. "Thank you, Mr. P. Potter," he said, in the stuttering way he always spoke, the stammer that Harry had been told came from a traumatic encounter with a vampire in Albania, which seemed like the kind of backstory a person would have to be committed enough to actually almost die for. "No problem," Harry said. He watched Quirrell continue down the corridor, books reorganized, parchment secured. He stood where he was for a moment. Sub-level access, he thought. The 3rd floor. The forbidden corridor. The one Dumbledore had mentioned at the start of term feast with the almost comically casual death warning that Harry had stored in the back of his mind as interesting, we'll revisit. He looked at the closed door at the end of the corridor. It looked like every other door in Hogwarts, old wood, iron fixture, unremarkable, except for the detail that it was locked and forbidden, and Quirrell had been in this corridor with a structural layout diagram. He filed it. He went to get Hermione's books. He told Ron and Hermione about it at dinner. Ron's response was immediate, "That's well dodgy." Hermione's was more structured, it could be legitimate. He's a professor. He might be surveying the building for safety reasons or curriculum research or, Hermione, Harry said. "I know," she said. "It's dodgy." "Extremely," Harry said. "We should tell McGonagall," Hermione said. Harry considered this. "Not yet," he said. "I want to know more first. What I saw was a diagram. That's not, I can't walk into her office and say I saw Quirrell drop a piece of paper and it looked suspicious. I want more than that." "How do you plan to get more?" Hermione asked. He looked at the 3rd floor corridor on the 2nd floor's landing, visible from where they were sitting if you craned around the archway. "Carefully," he said. "That's not a plan," she said. "It's the beginning of one," he said. Ron looked between them. "I want it noted," he said, "that I'm in, but that I'd also like it on the record that this has the shape of a thing that could go very wrong." "Noted," Harry said. "Good," Ron said, and helped himself to more potatoes. It was a Thursday in late September when Draco made his miscalculation. He had been following his father's advice, watching, not committing, staying back. But Draco was 12, and 12-year-old instincts did not always survive contact with provocation, and the provocation was specific. Harry Potter had just been invited, after 2 weeks of flying lessons, to become the Gryffindor Quidditch Seeker, and the whole school knew, and the particular architecture of Draco's pride had taken it poorly. He caught Harry in the entrance hall after dinner, with Crabbe and Goyle at his shoulders, which was a habit of intimidation that worked better on some people than others. "Heard you're Gryffindor's new Seeker, Potter," he said. "Yeah," Harry said. He was carrying a textbook under one arm and looked like he had places to be. "Did you need something?" "My father could buy my way onto the team if I wanted it," Draco said. "I don't want it." "Flying with Weasley's second-hand broom sounds, Draco," Harry said. Draco stopped. Not because Potter had said it sharply. He'd said it almost conversationally, which was somehow more arresting. He'd used his first name, which nobody at Hogwarts except his Slytherin housemates did. "You're smarter than this," Harry said. He said it without contempt, without performance, in the same calm voice he'd used in the corridor 2 weeks ago. "I've watched you in class. You're actually good. You work things out fast, you're decent at potions, your charms work is cleaner than half the year." He looked at Draco steadily. "So why are you standing in the entrance hall with Crabbe and Goyle making comments about Ron's broom?" Draco stared at him. "I'm asking genuinely," Harry said. "What is this for?" The entrance hall had gone somewhat quiet around them. There were a handful of students near the stairs, and they were watching with the particular attentiveness of people who sensed something that was either about to be very exciting or very surprising. Draco's first instinct was to say something cutting and walk away. His second instinct, slower and less comfortable, was that Harry Potter had just done something strange. He'd acknowledged Draco's actual capability in public, matter-of-factly, and now Draco either had to respond with something real or respond with something performance-y and have it seen as performance by everyone present including himself. Crabbe made a low, uncertain sound. Draco looked at Harry. Harry was watching him with patient attention, not waiting for a fight, just, actually waiting for an answer. "It's what you do," Draco said finally. It came out less polished than he'd intended. "Because your father does it?" Harry said. Still not unkind. Just direct. A beat. "I'm going to go do homework," Draco said. He turned, Crabbe and Goyle following, and he walked up the stairs without looking back. Behind him, he heard Ron Weasley say, in a low voice, what did you just do?" And Harry Potter said, "I have no idea. It felt right." Draco went to the Slytherin common room and sat in his usual chair by the fire and thought about what had just happened, and the thinking produced a slow, uncomfortable awareness that he was going to have to significantly revise his approach to the question of Harry Potter, because the approach he'd been attempting was not working and was, additionally, beneath him. He thought about what his father had said. The board is still being set up. He looked at the fire. He thought about the board. McGonagall called Harry to her office on the last Friday of September, the fourth such call, and by this point Harry went without any of the reflexive anxiety of the first time, swinging into the tartan cushioned chair with the ease of someone who had established that this particular office was a place where he was not in trouble and was not going to be. She had a letter on her desk. She pushed it toward him. He picked it up. Ministry of Magic seal. He'd gotten familiar with that seal. He read it. It was brief, official, and enormously significant in the way that brief official letters tended to be. It informed Harry James Potter that the investigation into the case of Sirius Orain Black, previously convicted of the murder of 12 Muggles and the betrayal of James and Lily Potter, had been escalated to a full Wizengamot review following the discovery of evidence inconsistent with the original investigation's findings. He was named as an interested party. He would be notified of developments. "What evidence?" Harry asked. "I don't have the details," McGonagall said. "But Amelia told me, informally, not for official record, that the original investigation contained a significant gap. The evidence at the scene pointed to Sirius Black, but certain aspects of the physical evidence were never fully examined because the conclusion was assumed before the analysis was complete." She paused. "I'm told that a more thorough examination has produced questions about the actual mechanism of the explosion. About what really happened in that street." Harry set the letter down. He thought about the man in the photograph, the wide grin, the arm around his father's shoulders. He thought about 10 years in Azkaban. "How long does a Wizengamot review take?" he asked. "Weeks, usually. Months at most." She folded her hands. "It's moving quickly because Bones is pushing it." "She's good at her job," Harry said. "Exceptionally." He nodded. He picked the letter back up, folded it, and added it to the collection that was accumulating in the inside pocket of his robes, the note from the first meeting, the photograph, and now this. He reflected, starting to carry documentation of his own life like evidence. Maybe that was appropriate. "There's something else," he said. She looked at him. "I want to tell you something, but I need you to not immediately act on it. I need to watch it a bit more first." "I'll make no promises I can't keep," she said, which was, he recognized, a specifically McGonagall form of agreement. He told her about Quirrell. The diagram. The architectural layout. The third-floor corridor. He told it straightforwardly, without dramatizing it, because the facts didn't need dramatizing, they were already strange enough on their own. She listened without interrupting, which was something he'd noticed she did when the information was being sorted into serious categories. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Have you told anyone else? She said. Ron and Hermione. Of course. She looked at him. Harry, you should know that the third-floor corridor is not simply forbidden for the sake of being forbidden. There is something in it that is, being protected. I won't tell you what, because that information is above your year level, and before you say anything, she held up a hand, because she'd learned to anticipate this. I'm not withholding it to be mysterious. I'm withholding it because the more people who know specifically what it is, the less safe it is. Harry considered this. Is Quirrell a threat to it? She looked at him steadily. You saw a diagram. That's concerning. But it's not yet evidence of intent. I'm not going to go up there on my own, he said. I'm not an idiot. I know you're not, she said. That's why I'm having this conversation with you instead of simply telling you to stay out of it. What are you going to do about Quirrell? Watch him, she said. More carefully than I have been. She paused. You were right not to come to me immediately with only the diagram. You were also right to eventually tell me. The balance of those two decisions is good judgment, Harry. He took that in without deflecting it, which was something he was practicing, accepting when things were being said straight rather than immediately minimizing them. Can I ask you something about it? He said. The thing being protected. You can ask. I may not answer. Is it connected to Voldemort? The name didn't make her flinch. He'd noticed that about her. She said the name, when she said it, like it was a word and nothing more. She looked at him now with the particular careful expression of someone balancing honesty against operational caution. Why do you ask? She said. Because Quirrell's turban smells strange, Harry said. I noticed it the first time I was near him in class. Like something, burned, or wrong. And when I'm near him I feel, he paused. I feel something in my scar. Not pain. Just pressure. Awareness. He touched his forehead briefly. Like it recognizes something. McGonagall was very still. You haven't mentioned the scar before, she said quietly. I'm mentioning it now, he said. I've been watching it for 3 weeks to see if it was consistent. It is. Every time Quirrell is nearby. Every defense class. He looked at her. It's not random. She stood up. She went to her fireplace. She stood with her back to him for a moment, and he watched her shoulders and recognized the particular tension of someone running decision trees very fast. She turned around. I need to speak with the headmaster today, she said. This is no longer something I can watch and see on my own authority. You understand that? Yes, he said. You're not going near the third-floor corridor. No, he said. And you're not going to do anything about Quirrell yourself. He met her gaze. Not unless I have to, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. He looked back at her steadily, not defiant, not apologetic, just honest. He wasn't going to promise he'd stand by if something happened. She was smart enough to know that, and he was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. Not unless you have to, she repeated. She said it like she was committing it to record. Yeah. She nodded once. Go to dinner. Do your homework. Go to Quidditch practice tomorrow. Wood has been extremely enthusiastic about you, which I imagine is either motivating or exhausting. Both, Harry said. Definitely both. He stood. Harry. He stopped at the door. The scar, she said. If it hurts, not pressure, pain, you tell me immediately. Not the next day. Not the next convenient moment. Immediately. Okay, he said. I'm serious. I know. He paused. I know you are. He went to dinner. The great hall was its usual controlled chaos, for house tables, hundreds of voices, the ceiling tonight showing a clear autumn sky going purple at the edges, stars beginning. He slid in beside Ron, who was already eating with the commitment of someone who'd had a long day, and across from Hermione, who was reading something while eating, which was apparently against her own rules but happened anyway. "McGonagall?" Ron said, without looking up. "Yeah," Harry said. "Good news, bad news, or complicated news?" Harry helped himself to food. He thought about Quirrell and the diagram and his scar and the Wisengamot review and the photograph in his pocket. "All three," he said. "Right," Ron said, and pushed the potatoes toward him. "Quirrell," Hermione said, from behind her book. "You told her?" "Yeah. And?" "She's talking to Dumbledore." Hermione lowered the book. She had the look she got when pieces were arranging themselves into a picture she didn't fully like the shape of. "And us?" "We keep watching," Harry said. "And we stay out of the corridor." "Obviously," Hermione said. "For now," Harry added. Hermione looked at him. "That's not a version of obviously." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Ron ate his potatoes and looked between them with the expression of a person watching a match to see who won. Harry ate his dinner and watched the purple ceiling go gradually dark and full of stars, the way it actually was above the lake outside, real stars reflecting in real water, and he thought about a gaunt man in a stone cell knowing something had changed, and a diagram on a piece of parchment, and a scar on his forehead that pressed when the wrong person stood too close. The pieces were on the board. Not fully set yet. But moving. He could feel them moving the way you felt weather coming before the sky changed, in the pressure, in the air, in the way everything seemed to be angling toward something without knowing yet what shape it would take. He was not afraid of it. He was paying attention, and he was not afraid, and those two things together felt, at 11 years old, with the photograph of his father in his pocket and his food in front of him and his friends on either side, like they might be enough. They might, actually, be more than enough. Chapter 5, The Fire Under the Castle. The Wisengamot review of Sirius Black's case broke into public consciousness on a Tuesday in October, and it broke loudly. Harry found out the way most of Hogwarts found out, through the Daily Prophet, which arrived with the owls at breakfast and landed on tables across the Great Hall with a front page that took up no space at all with subtlety. The headline read, "Black Case Reopened, Ministry Admits NO Trial Was Held." Below it, a photograph of Sirius Black from what must have been his arrest, hollow-eyed, wild-haired, the remnants of the man in Harry's photograph present but buried under 10 years of Azkaban like something submerged. Harry looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he read the article. It was thorough in the way that Prophet articles occasionally were when they'd gotten hold of something they couldn't sensationalize more effectively by being vague. The facts were stark enough on their own. Sirius Black had been arrested on November 2, 1981, transported directly to Azkaban without charge or trial, and held for 10 years under a conviction that had never been legally established. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, under head Amelia Bones, had reopened the case following what the article described as new investigative priorities, which Harry understood was ministry speak for we were asked to actually look at this properly for the first time. The physical evidence section was what stopped him. Witnesses had reported that Sirius Black had cornered Peter Pettigrew in the street, that there had been an explosion, that 12 muggles had died and Pettigrew had been killed, and that Sirius Black had been found laughing at the carnage. This had been taken, combined with the allegation of betrayal, as sufficient evidence of guilt. What the new investigation had found, buried in the original scene report, apparently never followed up, was that the curse used to create the explosion had been cast from behind Sirius Black, not by him. The angle of impact was wrong. The magical residue pattern was wrong. And Peter Pettigrew had not, as assumed, been killed in the explosion. They hadn't found a body. They'd found a finger. One finger. Harry set the newspaper down. Ron, who had been reading over his shoulder, said, "Blimey. One finger," Harry said. "I mean, yeah, one finger is not, that's not a body, is it?" Ron said. "No," Harry said. "It's not." Hermione had her own copy and had been reading in a parallel track, and now she looked up with the expression she got when something had reorganized itself into a new and startling configuration. If Pettigrew wasn't killed, then someone wanted people to think he was, Harry said. And Sirius Black was meant to take the blame, Hermione said. For all of it. The three of them looked at each other across the breakfast table. Pettigrew was the secret keeper, Harry said. He'd read enough by now. McGonagall had given him a book, quietly, about the Fidelius charm, about how the secret of his parents' location had been protected, to understand the mechanism. Not Sirius. That's what the article says. The Ministry is saying their original assumption about who held the secret was wrong, Hermione said. Completely wrong. Which means Sirius Black didn't betray your parents, Ron said. He said it with the directness of someone who had grown up in a household where Sirius Black was not spoken of well, and who was now adjusting that understanding in real time. He was set up. Looks like, Harry said. The great hall noise continued around them, but their small section of it had gone quiet, the way small sections of large noisy rooms went quiet when something significant was being processed. Harry was aware of other students reading the same article, of the specific energy that moved through a space when shared information was being collectively absorbed. He looked at the photograph of Sirius Black again, the hollow eyes, the wild hair. He looked at what 10 years of wrongful imprisonment looked like on a person's face and then looked away. He folded the newspaper and put it in his bag. McGonagall, he said. Probably already knows, Hermione said. Yeah, but I'm going anyway. She did already know. She was at the staff table with the prophet open in front of her and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, and when Harry appeared at the end of the table she gave him a look that contained several layers of information simultaneously, the topmost one being, yes, and I know what you're going to ask. Is it real? He said. Not the article, he knew the article was real. He meant the evidence, the substance, the thing underneath the headline. Amelia called me this morning, she said quietly. Before the paper arrived. The evidence is solid. The finger was Pettigrew's, they've confirmed it magically. The curse angle has been verified independently by 3 Aurors who reviewed the original scene data. She looked at him steadily. Sirius Black did not betray your parents. The great hall noise pressed around them. When do they let him out? Harry asked. It's not that simple, she said. The Wisengamot review happens in 2 weeks. There'll be a formal exoneration, testimony, official record setting. Then release. She paused. They won't just open the door. There's procedure. He's been in there for 10 years for something he didn't do, Harry said. Not with heat. Just, placing the fact. I know, she said. He looked at her. Are you going to the review? Yes, she said. As your interim guardian and a witness to the original circumstances, I've been asked to give testimony. Dumbledore will also testify. She paused on the last word in the way that suggested complexity was attached to it. He's been quiet, Harry said. Dumbledore. Since all of this started. He has, she said, and didn't elaborate. Harry nodded. He went back to his friends. The Quidditch pitch on a cold October morning was one of the few places in Harry's life where time organized itself cleanly around a single physical thing. Oliver Wood's training sessions were intense in a way that Harry found genuinely enjoyable, not because he was a natural at being coached, but because Wood's focus was absolute and infectious, and the air at that height was sharp and cold and real in a way that demanded your complete presence and gave you nothing back but the physics of flight and the problem of the snitch. He'd found the snitch in 12 of the last 14 practice sessions. The other 2 he'd deliberately let go, once because the light had been genuinely bad and he'd needed to learn how to search in poor conditions, once because he'd been testing the nimbus's turning radius in tight spirals and had made a decision that technique was more important than the catch that day. Wood had been briefly upset by both instances and then, when Harry had explained his reasoning, had gone into a kind of reverent silence that suggested he was reconsidering his entire coaching philosophy. "You don't just go for it," Wood said, after the second one. "Not always," Harry said. "A seeker who can let go of the snitch on purpose is," Wood shook his head. "Do you know how rare that is?" "No," Harry said honestly. "Very," Wood said. "Very, very." This morning's practice was different. Wood had set up a complex drill involving the chasers and beaters in a formation that required Harry to navigate active play, real bludgers, real players, real spatial problem-solving rather than the relatively controlled conditions of pure snitch searching. Harry had known about the drill since Tuesday when Wood posted it, and he'd spent approximately 20 minutes Wednesday night thinking about it before he'd realized he was overthinking it and stopped. He was in the air now, and the drill was running, and the difference between thinking about it and doing it was exactly what he'd expected. The thinking bore no resemblance to the experience of 3 bludgers navigating the same space as 7 players and a snitch that had no obligation to be findable. He spotted it 11 minutes in. Bottom left quadrant of the pitch, near the Slytherin goalposts. Moving fast and erratically, the way it did when the ambient magical field was complex, which it always was when a full team was in play. He didn't immediately go for it. He held position, watched it for 4 seconds, calculated its probable trajectory, not with certainty. Snitches didn't have certain trajectories, but with the same instinctive pattern reading that had gotten him through 11 years of predicting when Vernon Dursley was going to be in a bad mood, which was an analogous skill if you thought about it sideways. He went. He went fast, not taking the straight line because a bludger was in that line and because the snitch was going to cut right in approximately 2 seconds, and he cut right in 3 to intercept the intercept, and his hand closed around warm vibrating metal in the cold air with the particular satisfaction of a thing done well, and he pulled up hard out of the dive into level flight. Wood made a sound from below that Harry was too high to hear clearly but whose general emotional content was not ambiguous. He came down. He landed. He was opening his hand to look at the snitch, it pushed against his palm, wings working, when the sound reached him. Not from the pitch. From the direction of the castle. A sharp crack. Then another. He looked up. There were figures running along the top of the castle wall, no, not running, moving, the specific purposeful movement of adults who knew exactly where they were going and were moving fast. 2 of them in ministry robes. He was still looking at the castle when his scar pressed. Not lightly. Not the faint awareness that came with proximity to Quirrell in a classroom. This was pressure with weight behind it, a leaning sensation in the bone of his forehead, like something was pushing from the other side. He was already moving toward the castle before Wood called after him. He found Ron and Hermione in the entrance hall, which was more than he'd hoped for. Hermione had a charms textbook under her arm and an expression of heightened alertness. Ron had his bag on one shoulder and was watching the staircase with open suspicion. Both of them turned when Harry came in from the grounds. "What's happening?" Harry said. "Ministry people came in," Ron said. 20 minutes ago. Went straight upstairs. At least 3 of them. 4, Hermione corrected. "I counted 4. Harry looked at the stairs. The pressure in his scar had eased when he'd moved away from the pitch and toward the castle, which meant whatever was pushing it had moved, toward the upper floors, not toward him. "3rd floor," he said. Hermione and Ron looked at him. "The scar," he said. He touched his forehead. "It's directional. I've been mapping it for weeks." "You've been mapping it," Hermione repeated. "You've been tracking which direction your scar hurts to triangulate the source, yeah. That's actually very clever," she said, as if this had surprised her, which it clearly had. "Thank you," Harry said. 3rd floor. Whatever's up there is on the move. What do we do?" Ron said. "Follow," Harry said. "McGonagall said," Hermione began. "McGonagall said I shouldn't go up there on my own," Harry said. "I'm not on my own. And she said not unless I have to." He looked at his scar, then at the stairs. Ministry people running through the castle on a Saturday morning. Quirrell's been acting strange for weeks, and whatever's in the third-floor corridor is apparently moving. I think this qualifies. A beat. Right then, Ron said, and started up the stairs. Hermione made a sound that expressed several things simultaneously: frustration, resignation, and the resolve of someone who was going to be part of this regardless, and followed. Harry went last, and as he went up the stairs, the scar pressure intensified by measured degrees, like a compass needle swinging toward north. The third-floor corridor was not empty. It was also not what Harry had expected, though he hadn't fully articulated what he'd expected. The door at the end of the corridor, the one that was locked and forbidden, stood open. The lock on it was broken from the outside, the iron latch bent back in the way metal bent when someone who was very strong or very angry had applied force to it without a key. The sound coming from beyond it was low and strange. Harry looked at the door. He looked at Hermione and Ron. He pushed the door open and went through. Beyond was a room that shouldn't have been large enough to contain what it contained. The castle worked like this, he was learning, spatial logic being a suggestion rather than a rule. The room was large and stone-floored and lit by torches that burned greenish, and in the center of it, behind a large trapdoor that stood open, was a dog. Not a regular dog. A three-headed dog the size of a small house, all three heads focused intently downward into the trapdoor, growling at something below with a low continuous sound like a very large motor running badly. "Oh," Ron said. "Three heads," Hermione said, with the specific tone of someone filing information even when they were terrified. The dog had not yet noticed them because all three of its attention systems were directed downward. Harry looked at the trapdoor. Something had gone down there. The pressure in his scar told him something was below, not in this room, below this room, further down. "Quirrell went down," Harry said quietly. "How do you know?" Ron said, equally quietly, maintaining the extremely sensible practice of not alerting the three-headed dog. "Because my scar is pointing down," Harry said. "And the trapdoor was already open when we got here." He looked at it. Someone went down. The dog would have stopped them unless he noticed the harp. In the corner, small and mundane against the vast stone wall, a harp with no player that was producing a low continuous music. He recognized the mechanism, something was charmed to play, and the dog was following the music the way any dog followed a thing that soothed it, three heads swaying very slightly, growling more softly than they might have. "The music's keeping it calm," Hermione said. "If it stops," Ron said. "Let's not let it stop," Harry said. He looked at the trapdoor. He looked at Hermione and Ron. "I need to go down," he said. "One of you needs to stay here and make sure that harp keeps playing, and one of you needs to go get McGonagall." "I'll get McGonagall," Hermione said immediately. "Ron, can you keep a giant dog calm with a spell?" Ron said. "Yeah, brilliant, great, love this plan." "You can do it," Harry said, and meant it. "You've got good instinct magic, Ron. The harp plays itself, you just need to make sure it doesn't stop. If it starts to wind down, perpetuate charm, we covered it in Music of Magic elective, you took it, I remember it," Ron said, looking at the harp with focused eyes. "Go." Hermione was already gone, running silent on the stone floor. Harry went to the trapdoor. He looked down. There was a drop, significant, maybe 15 feet, into darkness, and below the darkness a faint green luminescence that was not natural and not comfortable. He could feel the scar pressing steady and certain downward. He sat on the edge, legs dangling into the dark, and dropped. He fell through something soft, vines, he realized, devil's snare, which he knew from herbology was light-sensitive and would strangle you if you panicked and fought it, and he did not panic and he did not fight it. He went still and he reached into his pocket for his wand and produced a sharp clean burst of light that made the vines recoil instantly, and he dropped through them cleanly and landed on stone. He looked around. He was in a long chamber. Ahead was a door, and from beyond the door came light, bright, moving, chaotic light, and a sound he recognized after a moment as wings. Hundreds of wings. He went through the door. Keys. Hundreds of flying keys in a high vaulted room, and on the far wall a locked door, and broomsticks racked along one side. He studied the door. He studied the keys. He understood the puzzle in approximately 8 seconds, not because he was arrogant about it but because the logic was clean once you saw it, an old lock needing an old key, and old keys had nicks and were patterns that new ones didn't, and the one he needed would be the one that looked most used. He took a broom. He went up. He found the key in 2 minutes. It was a worn silver one with a bent wing, and it was flying erratically because its wing was damaged, which told him someone else had grabbed it recently and damaged the wing catching it. He grabbed it, descended, unlocked the door, went through. The next room was a chessboard. Human-sized pieces, stone, arranged in the configuration of a game already in progress. He studied the board. There were marks in the stone, disturbances where pieces had moved recently. Someone had played through this. He could read the game's history from the marks the way you read a path by its footprints. He could see where someone had moved what, and he could see, from the current configuration, that there was a clean route through that didn't require him to sacrifice anything, not the elegant line, but a functional one, and he took it piece by piece, moving through the board, and arrived at the opposite door in 4 minutes. He was aware, moving through these chambers, that they were designed to be obstacles. He was also aware that whoever had come through before him had moved fast, the devil's snare had been left in disarray, the chess game was half finished in a rushed line rather than a solved one. Quirrell had come through knowing what was ahead. Harry was working it out in real time and was still moving faster. This told him something about the difference between knowing and understanding. The next chamber had a troll, unconscious. Someone had already dealt with it, and he went past it and didn't look at it too long and was glad someone had taken care of it. Then potions. A logic puzzle, a row of bottles and a riddle about which was safe to drink. He read it twice. He picked the correct bottle in 60 seconds. It was cold going down, sharp and mineral, and the fire barrier in front of the next door parted and let him through. The last room was lit by purple flame in brackets along the walls. And in it was not Quirrell. In it was Quirinus Quirrell, yes, but Quirrell was standing with his back to the far wall, hands at his sides, and his posture was wrong. Not Quirrell's usual uncertain, flinching posture. This was upright and still in a way that Quirrell never was, and the stutter was gone when he spoke. "Harry Potter," he said. "I wondered when you'd arrive." "You dropped the diagram," Harry said. 3 weeks ago. "I've been paying attention since then." "Yes. I noticed." Quirrell's head tilted. "You're not afraid?" "No," Harry said. "Should I be?" "Most would be." "I'm not most." He was looking at Quirrell's face, or rather, looking at the wrongness of Quirrell's face, the quality of stillness that didn't belong there, the way the voice wasn't quite coming from the same depth that Quirrell's voice usually occupied. His scar was pressing hard. Not painful, intense. Specific. Like a finger pressed into the center of his forehead. The turban, he thought. Not Quirrell's trauma from Albania. Something else. Something at the back of Quirrell's head, beneath the turban, that was the source of the pressure, the source of the wrongness, the source of what his scar had been trying to tell him since the first week of September. "What's under the turban?" he said. A pause. "Perceptive," said Quirrell, or not Quirrell, in a voice that had shifted register. Lower. Something behind Quirrell's voice like a shadow behind a candle. "You've been working it out for a while." 3 weeks, Harry said. "I'm fairly sure I know what you are. What's left of you?" "Then you know what I want," the voice said. "The stone. Give me access to the mirror, and I'll let you leave." The mirror. Harry looked around the chamber. On the far wall, covered in dark cloth, was a large frame. The stone was in there, whatever the stone was. McGonagall had not told him exactly, but he'd been listening carefully in the right places for 2 months and he'd assembled the shape of it. Philosopher's Stone. Immortality. A man who had spent 10 years as less than a ghost trying to become whole again. Not Quirrell. Quirrell was a vessel. "I'm not going to do that," Harry said. "You're 11 years old," said the voice. "I know," Harry said. "And I'm still not going to do it." The thing in Quirrell moved. The body turned and the hands went to the turban, beginning to unwrap it, and Harry's scar spiked, not pressure now but a sharp, searing heat that he felt from his forehead down through his jaw, and he put his hand up involuntarily, pressing against it. "Look," said the voice. He looked. The back of Quirrell's head, revealed as the turban fell away, was wrong in a way that was beyond ordinary wrongness. It was a face, a partial face, flat and pale and red-eyed, looking at him from where the back of a skull should have been, and the heat in Harry's scar flared again at the sight of it, and he understood in his body before he understood in words exactly what he was looking at. Voldemort. What was left of him? Harry had grown up terrified of a name that adults around him whispered. He'd grown up under the weight of a story about a boy who'd survived and what that survival cost and the enormous shadow cast by a thing that had been defeated. He'd spent his first 11 years in a house that thought magic was abnormal and had worked very hard to ensure he never learned who he was. He looked at the face on the back of Quirrell's head, and he felt the scar burn, and he felt something very particular and specific in his chest that was not fear. It was anger. Clean, focused, completely unclouded by fear. This was the thing that had killed his parents. This was the thing that had made the story that had hung over his life since before he could remember. This was the thing people were afraid to name, that had turned his childhood into 10 years of a cupboard and a garden and not enough food and a burned scar on his wrist that had healed wrong because no one had taken him to a doctor. Not all of that was Voldemort's fault. Most of it was the Dursleys' fault. But the first domino, the night of October 31st, 1981, that was this thing's work. He stood in the purple-lit chamber and looked at it and was not afraid of it. "You can't touch me," Harry said. Not a question. The red eyes narrowed. "What makes you say that?" "My skin," Harry said. "My mother's protection. When you possess Quirrell, you can work through him. But if you touch me directly," he was working it out as he said it, the same way he worked out chess moves and key patterns and curse angles. "You can't. That's why Quirrell is doing this for you. You can't touch me yourself." A silence. "Clever," the voice said, and it wasn't a compliment. It was the tone of a thing recalibrating. Quirrell moved. Not to touch Harry, the voice had confirmed the assessment by the way it paused, but toward the covered mirror. Harry moved at the same time, getting between Quirrell and the mirror, which was not a long-term solution but was the immediate available action. "Get out of his way," the voice said. "No," Harry said. Quirrell lunged. Not for Harry, for the mirror cover, reaching past him, and Harry grabbed Quirrell's arm by reflex, both hands, and what happened next was not something he planned or understood in the moment. It happened in approximately 3 seconds and it felt like grabbing a live wire. The protection his mother had left in his skin met whatever Voldemort was using to possess Quirrell, and the collision of those two things produced something that was not a spell and not exactly heat but was absolutely, completely overwhelming in the small sealed space of that chamber. Quirrell screamed. Harry held on. Not because he was certain it would work. Because it was working and stopping would have been the wrong choice, and he understood that in his nerves and his hands and the bone of his forehead where the scar burned bright and extraordinary. Quirrell's skin where Harry's hands gripped it began to blister. The screaming got worse. Harry held on. He heard the mirror crack behind them. He heard something that wasn't sound, a voice, or the absence of a voice, something leaving, something departing from a space it had occupied, like a change in pressure, like a window opened. The room went cold and then very still. Quirrell collapsed. Harry let go. He stood in the chamber, breathing hard, hands shaking, not with fear, with the physical aftermath of something his body had done that it hadn't known it could do. He looked at Quirrell on the floor. The man was alive, he could see breathing, shallow and rapid, but unconscious and likely to stay that way. The wrongness was gone from his posture. He was just Quirrell again, small and still. The face on the back of his head was gone. Harry stood there for a moment. His scar was quiet for the first time in 2 months. He looked at the mirror. The cloth cover had partially fallen. He could see the gold frame, the inscribed letters across the top, Erist stra eru oit ube kafru oit on wosi, and in the mirror's surface, he could see himself. Just himself. And standing behind him in the reflection, hands on his shoulders, were a man and a woman he'd only ever seen in a photograph. He looked at them for a long time. He didn't touch the mirror. He didn't try to step into the reflection. He just looked at his parents' faces, his mother's green eyes, his father's hair, both of them young and smiling and looking at him with expressions that were not grief and not regret but something forward-facing and warm. He nodded once. Then he turned away from the mirror. He sat down on the stone floor next to the unconscious professor and he waited, because upstairs Ron was keeping a 3-headed dog calm and Hermione was getting McGonagall and the cavalry was coming, and some things were done and he could sit with that. He was sitting there, breathing slowly, his hands steady now, when the door behind him burst open and McGonagall came through it first, her wand already out, 2 ministry aurors behind her, and she stopped when she saw him, just stopped, completely, taking in the chamber, Quirrell, the mirror, Harry sitting cross-legged on the stone floor. He looked up. "I found Quirrell," he said. "He's alive. I think he's going to need medical help quickly, though. Whatever was using him is gone." She looked at him for a very long moment. She looked at the mirror. She looked at Quirrell. She looked at Harry's hands, at the faint redness on his palms where his mother's protection had burned through contact with Voldemort's occupied vessel. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No," he said. "My scar's quiet, though. For the first time all term." He paused. "My hands are a bit sore." She came and crouched in front of him, she, who did not generally crouch in front of students, she who maintained the vertical authority of her height as a matter of professional principle, and she looked at his hands and then at his face and she said, very quietly, "How did you know to come here?" "The scar," he said. "I'd been mapping it for weeks. Tonight it pointed here." "And the chambers? The puzzles?" "Logic," he said. "And flying. And Hermione's revision schedule, if I'm honest, the devil's snare thing was in her notes." McGonagall made a sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was the cousin of a laugh, a controlled, involuntary exhalation of something that was part disbelief and part something else, something warm and enormous that she immediately retrieved behind the professional exterior. "Come," she said, and stood up. "The aurors will manage Quirrell." He got up. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, not a hug, not a prolonged comfort gesture, just a brief, firm contact that lasted approximately 2 seconds and communicated more than a longer gesture might have, and then she removed it and said, "The hospital wing. Now. Your hands need looking at. I told you you held Voldemort's host body while your mother's embedded protective curse discharged through your skin and you have the audacity to tell me you're fine," she said, walking toward the door. "Move, Mr. Potter." He moved. Behind him, one of the aurors was already sending a Patronus message up through the floors. The other was crouching over Quirrell with a diagnostic wand. The mirror stood uncovered and quiet in its corner. As he went through the door, he heard, or thought he heard, or felt, in the quiet of his scar, something very far away and very faint that might have been relief, or departure, or something that had no clean name. He went upstairs. Ron was in the 3rd-floor room, sitting against the wall with his wand still pointed at the harp, the dog drowsing in the opposite corner, all 3 heads slow and heavy with the near sleep of something that had been charmed for the past 40 minutes. Ron looked up when Harry came through the trapdoor. His face went through 3 expressions in approximately 1 second. "Are you fine?" Harry said. "You can stop the harp." Ron lowered his wand. The music stopped. One of the dogs' heads lifted, registered no immediate threat, and put itself back down. "What happened down there?" "I'll tell you at dinner," Harry said. "That bad?" "That complicated," Harry said. "Not bad. Just a lot." Ron looked at Harry's hands. "Your palms are red." "I know." "Did you dinner?" Harry said. Ron stood up. He looked at Harry with the particular look he'd developed over the past 2 months, the look that had replaced the initial starry-eyed surprise at the famous Harry Potter with something more actual and more durable, the look of someone who had watched a person become legible to him over weeks and now read that person with the quiet accuracy of genuine knowing. "Right," Ron said. "Dinner." They went upstairs. Hermione was in the corridor, talking to Dumbledore, who had appeared at the top of the staircase with the Aurors and McGonagall. Harry saw Dumbledore look down the corridor at him, and something moved across the headmaster's face, complex and layered and impossible to name in a single word. Not surprise. Dumbledore was rarely genuinely surprised. Something closer to reckoning. A man looking at an outcome that had diverged from his map in ways he was only now measuring. Harry met his gaze. Not with hostility. Not with deference. Just, directly. Dumbledore held his gaze for a moment and then nodded, very slightly, the nod of a man acknowledging something he was still working out the full dimensions of. Harry nodded back and went to the hospital wing. He lay in the bed while Madame Pomfrey fussed over his hands with a salve that smelled like copper and beeswax, and through the high windows of the wing the October night was clear and enormous, and somewhere in London the Wisengamot was 2 weeks from an exoneration hearing, and in a stone cell in the North Sea a gaunt man with grey eyes sat in the dark. Harry looked at the ceiling. His scar was quiet. His hands would heal. He thought about the face in the mirror, his parents, their hands on his shoulders, forward-facing and warm, and he held that thought carefully, the way he held the silver needle, the way he held the photograph. He held it and did not let it go. Chapter 6. The world after November arrived and brought with it the particular quality of light that October's dramatics always gave way to, quieter, lower, the sky a pale silver over the lake every morning as if the world had decided to breathe out after holding it in. The castle settled back into its rhythms. Classes. Meals. The great churning ordinary machinery of 300 students living inside something that happened to be magical. Harry's hands healed in 4 days. Madame Pomfrey had kept him in the hospital wing for 2 nights, which he'd spent reading a book Hermione brought him about early transfiguration theory and eating an unreasonable amount of chocolate, which Pomfrey had prescribed for residual magical shock and which Harry had no objections to whatsoever. Ron had visited both evenings and sat on the end of the bed and they'd talked about Quidditch and the chess chamber. Ron had been furious, in a specific and theatrical way, about not having seen the chess chamber, and Harry had described it in enough detail that Ron had pulled out a pocket chessboard and made him reconstruct the position from memory, which he'd managed with approximately 90% accuracy. "You moved a bishop there?" Ron said, staring at the board. "Yeah. To take the knight." "Yeah. In 3 moves you could have had the queen instead." "I wasn't trying to win the game," Harry said. "I was trying to get to the other side." Ron had sat back and looked at the board with an expression that suggested this distinction was either profound or deeply irritating and he hadn't decided which. Hermione had come both mornings and sat in the chair and very carefully not asked questions about what had happened in the chamber, which was the most enormous restraint Harry had ever witnessed from her, and he'd rewarded it on the second morning by telling her everything in complete detail, which she had absorbed with total focused silence and then said, "Your mother's sacrifice created a countercharm embedded in your blood." That's what McGonagall said. And physical contact with Voldemort's host caused it to discharge. "Yeah. That's an extraordinarily elegant piece of protective magic," she said, with the reverence she reserved for things that were both beautiful and precise. "My mum did it," Harry said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "She did." He was out of the hospital wing by Wednesday and back in classes by Thursday, and the school had managed, in his absence, to develop several theories about what had happened on Saturday night that ranged from plausible to completely deranged. The truth was known by McGonagall, Dumbledore, Pomfrey, Bones, and the Aurors who'd responded. It was not published in the Prophet, not yet, which Bones had explained to Harry was deliberate. The stone's existence was not publicly known. Quirrell's possession was not publicly known. The official story, for the moment, was that Professor Quirrell had suffered a serious magical accident requiring urgent medical care and would not be returning to Hogwarts. This satisfied no one and produced magnificent speculation. Harry let it run. It was significantly more entertaining than correcting it would have been. Dumbledore asked to see him on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after the chamber. McGonagall walked him to the office, which said something. She didn't say anything on the way up the spiral staircase. She was quiet, in the particular way she was quiet when she was giving him space to prepare himself rather than filling the air with information. He appreciated that she knew the difference between useful quiet and abandonment. The office was everything the stories said it would be and also nothing like what the stories said it would be, because the stories had been written by people processing awe, and awe was a bad journalist. It was large and circular and full of whirring silver instruments on spindly tables, and there were portraits of previous headmasters and headmistresses along the walls, and Fawkes was on his perch and turned one bright eye toward Harry when he came in, and Dumbledore was standing at the window looking out over the grounds. He turned when Harry entered. He looked older than Harry expected. Not physically. Dumbledore was ancient in all the ways he'd always been ancient, the white beard and the half-moon spectacles and the robes of deep blue. But there was something in his face that was different from the figure at the start of term feast, from the man Harry had seen across the great hall on various occasions, careful and certain. Now he looked like a man who had been carrying something at a particular angle for a long time and had recently been informed that the angle had been wrong the whole time. "Harry," he said. "Please sit down." Harry sat. McGonagall positioned herself near the door, not behind Harry but not at his shoulder either, beside, slightly, the geometry of someone who was present without being intrusive. "I owe you several things," Dumbledore said, sitting across from him. "An explanation. An apology. And, I think, an honest conversation, which I should have had with you rather sooner." He paused. "I will start with the apology." Harry looked at him. "I placed you with your aunt and uncle believing I was making the safest choice available," Dumbledore said. "The blood protection was real, the charm your mother cast required you to be with her blood in order to remain active, and it kept you alive for 10 years, and that is the best argument I have for the decision." He held Harry's gaze steadily. "It is not, I have come to understand, in ways I should have understood much sooner, sufficient argument for the conditions in which you lived. I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself the discomfort was necessary. I did not check. I should have checked. I did not, and children were harmed by my failure to do so, specifically you, and I am sorry." The office was quiet. One of the silver instruments ticked softly. Fawkes made a low musical sound. Harry sat with the apology. He'd thought about this conversation, off and on, since September. He'd thought about what he wanted to say to Dumbledore when the moment came, whether he wanted to be angry, whether he wanted to make it difficult, whether the old man deserved the difficulty or whether difficulty served anyone at this point. He'd thought about it methodically and he'd arrived at a position that felt honest. "I believe you," he said. "That you thought you were making the right choice." He paused. "I also think you made it easier on yourself to believe that by not checking. Because checking would have made the choice harder." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That is accurate." "I'm not going to spend a lot of time being angry at you," Harry said. "Not because it doesn't deserve anger. But because the thing is done. The Dursleys are being prosecuted. My guardianship is being sorted. Sirius, he stopped. Sirius is being exonerated. Those things happened because McGonagall saw something and acted on it. The anger is most useful pointed at the system that let it happen, not just at you specifically. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He looked at Harry with an expression that was, undeniably, something very close to grief. You are, he said carefully, a remarkable person, Harry. I'm 11, Harry said. I'm just practical. They are not mutually exclusive. No, Harry agreed. I suppose not. A pause. I want to ask you something, Harry said. And I want an honest answer. I will give you the most honest answer I can. The stone, Harry said. Was it always going to come down to me? Was any of it, the chambers, Quirrell, all of it, was I always going to be the one who ended up in that room? Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. The chambers were not designed with you specifically in mind, he said. They were designed to protect the stone. But, no. In honesty, I believed, when I set the stone's protections, that if it came to a confrontation, you would be involved. Not because I engineered it. Because the connection between you and Voldemort made your involvement likely regardless of what I arranged. He paused. I set protections I believed a student could theoretically get through if they had to, because I believed that you, specifically, might have to. You set the protections soft on purpose, Harry said. So I could get through them. Soft enough, Dumbledore said. Yes. That's, Harry thought about the word. That's either very clever or very irresponsible depending on how it went. It is both, Dumbledore said. As many of my decisions are, I'm afraid. Harry sat with this. He looked at Fawkes, who was watching him with the bright, patient gaze of a bird that had seen a great many things and had opinions about all of them. One more thing, Harry said. Yes. Don't do that again, Harry said. The thing where you make decisions about my life without telling me what you know. I understand you have information I don't have. I understand you've been doing this for 60 years and you know things I can't imagine yet. But I'm not a piece on a board. I'm a person. He said it without heat, without drama, with the same clean directness he'd used in the entrance hall with Draco, with the same evenness he'd brought to the interview with Bones. If there's something coming that involves me, I want to know. Not everything, I'm not asking for everything. Just the parts that are mine to know. Dumbledore looked at him across the desk, and the expression on his face was complex enough to deserve its own vocabulary, gratitude and guilt and something like relief and something like grief, and underneath all of it, visible in the way things were visible in people who were fundamentally honest, a respect that was not performed but arrived at. I will try, he said. I cannot promise to always succeed. But I will try. That's enough, Harry said. For now. He stood. He looked at Dumbledore's desk, the papers, the instruments, the sorting hat in its cabinet, the whole elaborate apparatus of a man who had been managing the magical world's crises for longer than most people had been alive. For what it's worth, he said, at the door. The stone is safe. You moved it, didn't you? When the Aurors got there, it was already gone. Dumbledore looked at him with mild surprise. Pomfrey's salve smelled like beeswax and copper, Harry said. The stone converts metals. I think the salve had trace amounts in it from the vial she used. She'd used the same vial to store something before. The stone had been moved through the hospital wing before it was secured elsewhere. He paused. I don't need to know where it is now. I just wanted you to know I worked it out. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then something happened to his face that was, against all the architectural complexity of his usual expression, simply a smile. Good, he said. See you at dinner, Harry said. He left. In the corridor, McGonagall fell into step beside him. Well, she said. "Good," he said. Which was what he'd said to Dumbledore, and which meant the same thing, not resolved, not finished, not without its complications, but honest and forward-facing. "Good," she said. They went down the stairs. The Wisengamot convened for Sirius Black's exoneration on a Thursday in mid-November, and McGonagall brought Harry to the ministry for it. She had asked him if he wanted to attend. She'd been clear that it wasn't required, he could wait at Hogwarts, could hear the outcome after the fact, could process it in whatever way suited him. She had been specific that the choice was his and that neither answer was wrong. He'd said yes immediately and with complete certainty. The Wisengamot chamber was underground, lit by floating candles, arranged in a high semicircle of wooden benches that rose in tiers to the ceiling. It seated 200. It was full. Harry sat in the gallery with McGonagall on one side and Amelia Bones, off duty today, attending as a witness rather than presiding, on the other. The formalities were procedural and extensive and conducted in the language of institutions that required precision as a form of respect, and Harry followed them carefully because they were important and also because he was learning, gradually, that patience was not the same as passivity. He'd been mistaking one for the other for most of his life, in both directions. Flinching was not patience, waiting was not passivity, and watching something unfold with your full attention was not the same as doing nothing. The evidence was presented. The curse angle, verified by 3 independent analysts. The lack of Pettigrew's body. The Fidelius charm records, which Bones's department had found in an archive that had apparently been sitting in a ministry filing room for 10 years without being cross-referenced with the arrest. The absence of any trial record. Each piece of evidence was placed on the official record in turn, methodical and cumulative, building the shape of something that had been wrong for a decade. Dumbledore gave testimony. He stood in the center of the chamber and spoke with a gravity that Harry thought was genuine, not performed gravitas but the weight of a man accounting for himself honestly in front of his peers. He said he had acted on assumption in 1981. He said he had been wrong not to verify. He did not attempt to mitigate it. McGonagall gave testimony. She was precise and unsparing and spoke for 8 minutes and said more with 8 minutes than most people said with 8 hours. Then they voted. The vote was not close. 173 to 9 for full exoneration. The 9 against produced a list of names that Bones wrote down in her own notebook, in the gallery, without looking up, and Harry looked at her writing them and understood that those 9 names were going somewhere after today that had nothing to do with this proceeding specifically. The chief warlock read the formal exoneration into the record. Harry sat in the gallery. He thought about a man in a stone cell who had heard something change in the quality of the dark. They brought Sirius Black in separately, while the chamber was still in session. He looked nothing like the arrest photograph in The Prophet and nothing like the photograph Harry carried, and he looked exactly like both of those things simultaneously, which was what 10 years did to a face. He was gaunt in the structural way of someone who had been gaunt for a long time, not dramatically wasted but built differently than he should have been, the bones of his face more prominent than they would have been on a man with adequate food and sunlight and the absence of dementors. His hair was long and dark and not entirely clean. He wore clothes that had been brought in for today because 10 years in Azkaban meant whatever you'd arrived in had not improved with time. He walked in under his own power, without needing the Auror escort to support him, and he held himself with a precision of effort that Harry recognized from somewhere inside himself, the particular uprightness of someone who is going to maintain their dignity because dignity is the one thing no one could actually take, even if they took everything else. He sat in the chair in the center of the chamber. He looked up at the gallery. He found Harry before Harry moved or spoke or indicated in any way that he was there, which told Harry something about the particular attention of a man who had been sitting with a picture in his mind for a very long time and could identify what he was looking for instantly. Sirius Black looked at Harry Potter. Harry looked back. Sirius Black's gray eyes, exhausted, too bright, full of too many things to sort in a single moment, held his gaze across the height of the chamber, and his expression was not what Harry had expected. He'd expected grief. He'd expected desperation. He'd expected the complex wreckage of a man who'd lost everything and was getting some of it back and didn't know how to hold both at once. What he saw instead was recognition. Not just Harry's face, though that was clearly part of it, the green eyes and the dark hair and whatever combination of his parents lived in his features. It was something else. Like Sirius was recognizing something in how Harry held himself, something in his expression, and finding in it an answer to a question he'd been carrying for 10 years. Harry nodded. Small, precise, the nod he'd given Dumbledore. The nod that meant, I see you. I'm here. This is real. Sirius held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then the proceedings resumed and Sirius had to look forward, and Harry exhaled slowly and looked at his hands in his lap, and McGonagall, without looking at him, placed one hand briefly over his and then removed it, and that was enough. They met properly in a ministry conference room, 2 hours later, while the formal paperwork was being processed and the exoneration was being entered into every record it needed to be entered into. It was a small room, practical, with a table and chairs and a window that looked out on a grey November sky. Harry sat on one side. Sirius sat on the other. McGonagall was present. She was near the window, giving them the geometry of the room, the table, the distance that made it a conversation rather than a confrontation. Sirius had his hands around a mug of tea. He'd been given food, which he'd eaten with the carefully controlled pace of someone who had learned not to eat too fast, and now he was looking at Harry across the table with the same expression as the chamber, recognition, and something underneath it that was working itself out slowly. You look like James, he said. His voice was rough from disuse in its lower registers. And like Lily. At the same time. McGonagall said that too, Harry said. The Lily part. Sirius looked at McGonagall briefly. Something passed between them, old and complicated, the way things between people who knew each other 30 years ago and had last met in circumstances of catastrophe were always complicated. She always noticed things, Sirius said. Before anyone else. Still does, Harry said. Something moved in Sirius's face that was close to a smile. It fit awkwardly, like a piece of furniture being returned to a room it hadn't been in for a decade. I know, he said. She noticed you. September 2nd, Harry said. First Transfiguration class. I know, Sirius said again. They told me the summary. The investigation. He stopped. His jaw set briefly. The Dursleys. They're being prosecuted, Harry said. I know. His grey eyes were steady. Are you? I'm fine, Harry said, and then stopped, because that was the automatic version, the one he'd been saying his whole life, and this was not a conversation that deserved the automatic version. I'm working on being fine. I'm better than I was in September. A lot better. He paused. I think I'll be properly fine eventually. I just haven't got there yet. Sirius looked at him with an expression that Harry couldn't name but that felt entirely without pity. That's honest, he said. I'm trying to be, Harry said. A silence. Not uncomfortable. More like a space being made for the size of what was in it. I need to say something, Sirius said. He set down the tea. I know we don't know each other. I know I'm a stranger who happens to have a legal relationship to you and a photograph in a wallet that I've been carrying in my head for 10 years. I'm not going to tell you what you should feel or what this is or what it's going to be. He looked at Harry directly. I'm just going to say that I loved your father more than I loved most things in my life. And I loved your mother, after I stopped being an idiot about her, which took an embarrassingly long time. And the night they died I wanted to die too, and I didn't, and Azkaban tried its level best to take what was left, and the thing that it couldn't take was, he stopped. His voice had gone rough at a different level now. Was the idea that you were somewhere. That you existed. That whatever else happened, you were alive. He exhaled. So whatever this is, whatever we are to each other, I just need you to know that you being alive mattered to someone. The whole time. Harry looked at him. He felt the thing behind his sternum that had been building since September, the thing that had started as a window opening and had been slowly filling with something, gradually, the way a room filled with light as the sun moved, and it shifted now into something he finally had a name for. Not happy. Not fixed. Not the end of something complicated. Safe. He felt safe, which was not a thing he had ever felt before in a way he could identify, and the identification of it, the naming of it, here, in this room, at this table, produced a very sudden and very complete understanding of how long he'd been without it. His eyes went wet. He didn't try to stop it. He'd spent 11 years performing not feeling in a house that punished feeling, and he was done with that particular performance. Okay, he said, and his voice was completely level even as the tears came, which was somehow both contradictory and entirely him. Okay. Sirius didn't reach across the table. He didn't make it dramatic. He just sat there with his tea and looked at Harry with grey eyes that were doing the same thing Harry's eyes were doing, and they sat with that for a moment in the small conference room while the Ministry worked around them. McGonagall, by the window, was looking very carefully at the grey November sky. It took 3 more weeks for the guardianship transfer to go through. There were Ministry forms in quantities that suggested the Department of Magical Family Services was compensating for 9 years of not doing paperwork by doing an extraordinary amount of it now. There were medical assessments, both Harry and Sirius, independently, the former for ongoing welfare monitoring and the latter for fitness to assume guardianship after a decade of Dementor exposure. There were interviews, financial assessments of the Black estate, which had been untouched since Sirius's arrest and turned out to be considerably substantial, and background checks that struck Harry as thorough to the point of satire given that the man had literally just been exonerated by 173 members of the Wisengamot. But it went through. On a Wednesday in early December, a Ministry document arrived at Hogwarts confirming that legal guardianship of Harry James Potter had been transferred to Sirius Orain Black, effective immediately. Harry read it at breakfast. He passed it to Ron, who passed it to Hermione, who read it with the expression she'd had after the exoneration hearing, a focused, private satisfaction, the look of someone who had helped push a boulder uphill for months and was watching it settle properly. "So you're going to Sirius's for Christmas?" Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. "If that's," he stopped. He'd been about to qualify it, to leave space for it not to happen, to protect himself from expecting something that might not materialize. He caught himself doing it and stopped. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to Sirius's for Christmas." "Where does he live?" Hermione asked. "He's got the Black family house in London," Harry said. "He says it's dark and depressing and he's planning to redecorate everything that can be redecorated, which he says should keep him occupied until approximately March." He paused. "He also says his mother's portrait is permanently screaming and he hasn't worked out how to remove it yet." Ron stared. "His mother's portrait screams?" "Apparently." Ron considered this. "Actually sounds kind of brilliant." "He said I could help with the redecoration," Harry said. "Which I think mainly means he wants company and has decided framing it as a project is more practical than just saying that." Hermione smiled. It was a small, real smile, the one she saved for things that weren't academically interesting but were humanly important. Harry drank his pumpkin juice. The great hall ceiling was showing a December morning sky, the first suggestion of winter in the pale cloud cover, and the hall was bright and warm underneath it, and across the room the staff table held its usual configuration, Flitwick talking animatedly to Sprout, Snape reading something with his usual expression of finding it inadequate, and McGonagall at the end of the table, reading the Prophet with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow in a way that suggested she was reading something she found interesting enough to forget the tea. She looked up, caught his eye. He raised his juice. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she used when she was deciding whether something warranted a response, and then she raised her own cup slightly, barely, the minimum perceptible gesture, and returned to the paper. He looked at his friends. December brought snow to the grounds and Quidditch practice moved indoors for the drilling sessions, and the first-year exams approached with the particular momentum of things that sounded more significant than they were in practice. Harry studied consistently and without anxiety, which Hermione found mildly offensive and Ron found inspiring. Draco Malfoy stopped him in the library on a Tuesday evening. Not aggressively. He came alone, which was already different, and he sat down at the table where Harry was reading without asking, which was presumptuous but not threatening, and he opened a book and appeared to be reading it for about 30 seconds before he said, quietly, without looking up, "My father wrote to me about the Wizengamot exoneration." Harry looked at him. "He didn't want me to say anything to you," Draco said. "He wanted me to watch and not commit. I've been doing that all term." "I know," Harry said. "You're pretty good at it, actually." Draco looked up. "He was wrong," he said. "Sirius Black was imprisoned without a trial. Whatever else he was, whatever my father thinks about him, that's wrong." He said it like someone putting down something they'd been holding uncomfortably. "And you were, the Dursleys were," he stopped. "My father didn't tell me that part. I read it in Bones's public statement." Harry waited. Draco pressed his lips together in a way that was very like the way his father probably pressed his lips together when acknowledging something he hadn't accounted for. I'm not asking you for anything. I just thought you should know that not everyone who looked at this situation the wrong way at the beginning is going to keep looking at it that way." Harry looked at him for a moment. Draco Malfoy, with his father's instincts and his father's politics and his father's watchful eyes, sitting in the library without Crabbe and Goyle, saying something honest because he'd worked out that honest was the accurate position. "Okay," Harry said. "That's it? What else do you want me to say?" Draco blinked. "I don't know. Something. You've been making comments about Ron for 2 months, Harry said." "I know. And you hexed Neville in the corridor in October." "That was..." Draco stopped. "Yes. I did." "So," Harry said. Draco was quiet for a moment. "So I should probably not have done that," he said. With the specific difficulty of someone who had never once in their life been required to practice this particular sentence. "Probably," Harry said. A silence. "Your father is going to have a problem with whatever's coming," Harry said, not unkindly. "I don't know exactly what's coming. But whatever it is, I think your father is going to be on the wrong side of it, and I think you know that, and I think that's what this conversation is actually about." Draco looked at him. "You're 11, he said. "You keep saying that like it means something," Harry said. Something moved in Draco's face that was not quite a smile. "I haven't worked out yet if you're going to be my enemy or not," he said, with a frankness that was surprisingly unguarded. "Neither have I," Harry said honestly. "But I'd rather wait and see than decide in advance." Draco nodded once, closed his book, and left. Harry watched him go and then went back to his reading, and he thought about boards and pieces and positions, and he thought about the difference between an enemy decided in advance and a person whose direction was still being chosen. He thought everyone was still choosing, really. Some people were just further along than others. The last night of term was the longest night of term, and Harry lay in his dormitory while the other boys slept and the castle made its nighttime sounds around him, the wind off the lake against the tower stones, the distant movement of something large in the grounds, the soft breathing of 4 other 11-year-olds who had no idea yet that the world was considerably stranger than they'd signed up for. He looked at the ceiling. He took the photograph out from under his pillow, where he'd kept it since McGonagall gave it to him in September, and he held it in the dim light. His father and Sirius and 2 others, he knew now who the others were, had learned their names from Sirius in careful, gradual doses over the past weeks in the letters they'd been exchanging. Remus Lupin, who had been a werewolf and a marauder and was currently living somewhere in the north and would, Sirius had said, be getting in touch when he was ready. Peter Pettigrew, who had not died in that street, who was somewhere out there, who had been a coward and a traitor and who was the last piece of the story that hadn't yet been placed. He looked at his father's face. The wide grin, the glasses, the messy hair. He'd been afraid, once, that learning about his parents would make everything heavier. That knowing who they were would just be another form of grief, a more specific grief, a more populated loneliness. He'd expected it to be painful in an acute way. It was painful. But it was also warm. It was like a room being opened that he hadn't known existed. His parents were people, real and specific and human and flawed and loved, and Sirius had told him stories about his father's arrogance in fourth year and his mother's extraordinary patience in correcting it and the way they'd both laughed together at the end of a thing that had nearly broken them apart, and those stories were not a weight on his chest. They were furniture. He was furnishing the room. It was going to take years and he was not in a hurry. He put the photograph back. He thought about Christmas. He thought about Grimmauld Place, which Sirius had described in letters with a mixture of horror and dark affection, the heads of former house elves on the wall which he was removing one by one, the drawing-room drapes which had been black for 40 years and were going first, the kitchen which was the only room he didn't hate because it was underground and the cold of Azkaban had made him perpetually appreciative of any room that could be made warm. He was going somewhere for Christmas. A specific, named somewhere, with a specific, named person. He'd been going somewhere for Christmas his whole life, a house in Surrey with a too-small room and a list of chores and the specific, weighted silence of a family that did not include him, and the somewhere he was going this year was a house in London that had heads on the wall and a screaming portrait and a man with grey eyes who had survived 10 years of Dementors by holding on to the fact that Harry was alive. He thought about the cupboard. He thought about it in the specific way he'd been learning to think about things that were over, not avoiding them, not drowning in them, just looking at them directly and clearly and then setting them down. The cupboard was done. The Dursleys were being prosecuted. The arrangement that had defined his life had been dismantled on a Tuesday morning in September by a woman who'd looked at his arms for 3 seconds and refused to look away. He was 11 years old. He had 2 friends who argued with him about Quidditch and charms and the correct way to approach every problem. He had a head of house who had fled the ministry before lunch. He had a godfather in London pulling down black curtains. He had a scar on his forehead that had been quiet for 6 weeks. He had a matchstick-turned needle somewhere in his trunk, silver all the way to the base. He had a long way to go, toward things he couldn't fully see yet. Voldemort was out there, diminished but not finished, Pettigrew was somewhere, there were forces aligning along axes he could feel but not yet map, and the magical world was full of people who would need him to be afraid or dependent or manageable and were going to find out, gradually, that he was none of those things. He had a long way to go and he was not afraid of the going. He pulled his blanket up. He looked at the dormitory ceiling one more time. The moonlight through the tower window made a pale silver rectangle on the stone floor, and in it he could see his own hand, the faint lines of old scars on his wrist, and he looked at them with the steady attention he'd been practicing since September, direct and clear and without flinching. He looked. He put his hand down under the blanket. He went to sleep. Morning came cold and bright, and the Hogwarts Express left at 11, and the platform was the particular beautiful chaos of hundreds of students and all their luggage and owls and families arriving in organized waves through the barrier from the Muggle side. Harry stood on platform 9 3/4 with his trunk and Hedwig's cage and Ron on his left making plans for letters over the holiday and Hermione on his right listing the books she intended to read between now and January in a way that was clearly meant to be informational but carried the subtle competitive charge of someone who wanted to know if you were going to keep up. He was going to keep up. He'd already made a list of his own. McGonagall found him at the far end of the platform, near the engine, where the noise was loudest and the steam thickest and the chaos was at its most concentrated. She appeared out of it with the same purposeful efficiency she appeared out of every other environment, and she handed him something, an envelope, sealed, his name on the front in her handwriting. "For the holiday," she said. "Don't open it on the train. Open it when you're settled." He took it. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Is everything okay?" he said. Everything is fine, she said. It's not urgent. It's a letter. She paused. From me. To you. Because I have some things to say that I thought better said in writing than in a doorway on a platform. He held the envelope. You know, he said, for someone who keeps telling me not to thank you, don't, she said. I wasn't going to, he said. I was just going to say, you should know. It made a difference. What you did. Not just in the practical sense. He stopped. He was not a boy who usually ran out of words, but this was a specific kind of difficult. In the sense that you saw something and you did something about it on the same day, and that mattered. It matters. She looked at him. She was very still for a moment, in the middle of the platform chaos, the steam and the noise and the families and the trunks and the particular madness of a term ending, and then she said, with complete control and the minimum possible drama, you were worth seeing. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he put the letter in his bag and picked up Hedwig's cage and said, see you in January, Professor. Mind your correspondence over the holiday, she said, already turning. And tell Mr. Black that if he wants a character reference for the adoption proceedings he's apparently considering, my office hours are Monday afternoons. He almost stopped walking. He mentioned it in a letter, she said, without turning. To me. Not to you yet. Don't let on you know. He stood on the platform for a second with Hedwig's cage in one hand and the kind of feeling in his chest that didn't have a name because it had never existed in him before and the language for it was going to have to be built from scratch. He started walking toward the train. He found his compartment. He settled Hedwig. He watched the platform through the window as the train began to move, the castle appearing above the treetops as they pulled out, its towers sharp against a clear December sky. He was not afraid of what came next. He was, and this was new, and real, and he was looking forward to it. The train picked up speed. The castle grew small. He looked forward.